Good morning, everyone. I am Carla Sainz, and I am Regional Advisor on Bioethics for PAHO. And before we begin the session, I would just like to inform those that are interested in getting the English interpretation. We have those services.
Please go on the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little globe that says interpretation, and please click on that and select English if you want to listen to the webinar in English. Es un gusto darles la bienvenida.
It's a pleasure to welcome all to session 7 of our series of virtual events related to clinical trials. These seminars have been co-organized by the Regional Program on Bioethics as part of the Office of Science and Knowledge from the Department of Evidence and Intelligence at the PAHO Research Unit, as well as the Office of Bioethics and Quality and Regulation in Medicines, which is involved in access to medicines and health technologies. In this session, we're going to discuss the research contracts as well as policies governing clinical trials. And I would like to start just to first of all, I want to provide some information as to how the session will be carried out. We are not giving any certificate for participation in this session, but I do invite you, and I'm going to share with you the information on the regional web page on bioethics at PAHO, and we kindly ask that you enter our regional network and enroll, where we can share the recordings of this session, just as we have shared the recordings of previous sessions. We will also share information concerning the upcoming seminar that will take place in 2025 after the end of year break. So we also would like to encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A box to upload your questions. You can start from the very beginning of our session. For any comments, any links that you would like to share with us or with the audience, that would be welcome, and you can upload that information plus your questions via the chat box. So I'm going to share the
voy a compartir una diapositiva con ustedes.
The following slides.
El tema de esta sesión,
so the main topic of this session is the result of a discussion that took place at the regional workshop aimed at strengthening clinical trials to provide quality evidence relating to health interventions and improving the quality and research coordination efforts. This proved to be, again, the end result of the WHO resolution. I want to make sure that my slide is visible to everyone. Well, this stemmed from a resolution issued by the WHO and the World Health Assembly, approved in 2022. The resolution has this specific title. We've also named our regional workshop the same. And the resolution has two considerations I want to highlight. First of all, this was a resolution that was requested by countries in our region. Secondly, I'd like to mention that the content of this resolution is closely aligned with the publication on catalyzing research in the region. And this is a result of experiences gleaned during the COVID-19 pandemic.
ciertamente somos la única
We
región
are the only
de la
region
OMS que ha tenido un
within the
ejercicio
WHO
durante la pandemia
that
al
underwent
de
this
evaluar
exercise
los
where we were able
desafíos
during
que
the
nos
pandemic to
encontrábamos
assess
en
not only
materia de
some of the
ética de la
challenges
investigación y en
posed
general para hacer
in
investigación
clinical
durante la
research.
pandemia. Y
And
tenemos
again,
una
during the
publicación
pandemic, we also have
que
a
está disponible en la
publication
página
that
web del
is
Programa
available
Regional de
on the
Bioética,
web
pero vamos a
page, on the
poner la información
Bioethics
también sobre el sitio web de
website.
esta publicación en
And
el
we're
chat.
going to give
Es una
you that
publicación
address. This
donde
is a
se
publication,
recoge
and we'll put it in the
nuestra
chat.
experiencia
This
y nuestros
encompasses our
desafíos y que tiene una
experiences,
serie de
challenges,
recomendaciones.
and it
Decía, las
also is followed by a series
recomendaciones
of recommendations.
de esta publicación, canalizar la
Recommendations
información de
contained
investigación
in
ética en
this
emergencias, están muy
publication
alineadas con
catalyzing
las
research
recomendaciones de
results is
esta
closely
resolución
aligned
de la OMS, la
to the
resolución
WHO resolution
WHA
WHA,
75.8. Ustedes pueden, los invito a revisar
and
el
I invite
informe
you
de
to
este taller
review
regional que
this
tuvimos
report
a
from the
raíz de esta
regional workshop.
resolución, con
Again,
el
this
objetivo
stemmed from the
específico
resolution
de
with the main
pensar
and
en
specific
nuestra
objective
región qué
of
significa
addressing
implementar esta
the
resolución, qué
implications of the
significa
implementation
fortalecer los ensayos
this
clínicos en nuestra
resolution.
región.
In other words, the
Entonces, en esta
significance of
reunión que se
implementing
llevó
these
a
clinical
cabo en ese
trials
taller
in
que
the
se llevó a
region.
cabo en
So
octubre del
this workshop
2023
took
en
place
Brasilia,
in October 2023 in
discutimos
Brasilia,
muchos temas,
where we
muchas
discussed
series, muchos,
many
digamos, impases, muchos
topics. We looked at
obstáculos
many
que estaban
obstacles and
dificultando el que
bottlenecks
nuestra
that
región
were
haga
hindering
no solo muchos
progress,
buenos ensayos
not
clínicos,
only
sino que además
significant
haga
progress in
grandes
the
ensayos
clinical
clínicos.
trials
Por
field,
ejemplo, un gran
but
ensayo
also
clínico regional.
major
Y un
overarching
tema muy
regional clinical
prominente
trial
en,
efforts.
en este
And something that
taller,
was very
en el que
prominent
tuvimos
in this
autoridades
workshop, where
nacionales,
we
tuvimos a
had
reguladores,
national
tuvimos
authorities,
investigadores, tuvimos
regulatory
a miembros del
authorities,
comité de ética,
researchers
fue
present, we had
el que
members
lo
of
que
ethics
dificulta,
committees.
lo que
So, what
demora
hindered
hacer
and
un
what
ensayo
slowed
clínico
down
con muchos países
a
de la región, un ensayo
multiple
clínico
country
multipaís,
clinical,
multicéntrico,
multi-country clinical
es que
essays
hacemos
or
muchas
trials
cosas
is that
con
we
frecuencia de una manera un
do
poquito
things
diferente. ¿A qué
somewhat
me
differently
refiero?
from country to country. What am I
Por ejemplo,
talking about? Well,
las
first of all,
pólizas de seguro.
insurance
Todos los
policies,
países
every
tienen,
country,
o casi todos los países
just about
requieren
every country,
pólizas para
has or
proteger a los
requires
participantes de los
policies
ensayos
to
clínicos.
protect the
Pero
parties
estas
involved
pólizas,
in
como vamos a
clinical
ver,
trials.
no son
But these policies
exactamente idénticas. Lo
are
que
not
cada país
always
requiere no es
identical.
exactamente
Each
idéntico.
country
Y
doesn't have
nuestra
the
presentación de hoy
identical
va a
requirements and
ahondar
features.
en
So
eso.
our presentation is going to do a deep
Del
dive
mismo
into
modo,
this
los contratos,
area.
todos hacemos los contratos
Contracts.
de
When
una
we look
manera
at
parecida, pero un
contracts,
poquito
each country
distinta.
addresses
Entonces, una
contracts a little differently.
sugerencia
So one
que
suggestion
se presentó como
that
una
arose
recomendación
as a
de este taller
recommendation
regional
from
del
this
año
regional
pasado
workshop last
fue
year
la posibilidad de
was looking at the
estandarizar las
possibility of
pólizas
standardizing
de los ensayos
insurance
clínicos, para los
policies
ensayos
governing
clínicos, y
clinical
estandarizar
trials
los
and
contratos para
standardize
hacer ensayos clínicos, de
contracts
manera que eso
that
facilite
authorize
que hagamos
clinical
un
trials.
gran
So
ensayo
this would
regional, sobre todo
enable
de manera rápida, sobre
holding
todo en
a
emergencias cuando el
regional
tiempo apremia,
clinical
pero
trial,
en
especially
general,
when it
sin gastar
were
demasiadas energías
pressed by
haciendo,
emergency conditions
haciendo
where we
digamos, gastando a tiempo
invest so much time
organizándonos,
organizing ourselves,
haciendo ajustes que pudiéramos haber
making
previsto de
adjustments
antemano.
that should have been
Entonces,
envisioned
bueno,
ahead of time.
en esa línea es que
So
hacemos
it's
esta
in
sección del día de hoy,
this vein
porque
that
desde
we
entonces nosotros
are
en
now
PAPS hemos
hosting
venido
this
trabajando
event
en
because
este
at
tema,
PAHO we've
especialmente
been conducting efforts
con una consultoría
with
de nuestro colega Carlos Burger, que quiero
consultations. We
invitar
have
a dar
Carlos
la
Burger,
sesión, el
who
doctor
I'm
Carlos
going to
Burger.
invite to speak
Es doctor en ciencias
who
jurídicas y sociales,
is
él es
a doctor
especialista en
in
bioética y en ética de
social
investigación.
sciences,
Él es
bioethics, and
coordinador
research.
del Comité
He
de
is
Ética
the
Central del
coordinator
Ministerio de Salud
of
de la provincia de Buenos Aires
the
y además es
committee
profesor de
on
ética en la
clinical
Universidad de
trials
Buenos
at the
Aires y la Universidad de La
University
Plata.
of Buenos
Sin
Aires and
embargo,
School of Medicine.
Carlos
Nevertheless,
ha sido
Carlos
además consultor
is
de la
also a
OPS para trabajar en
PAHO
estos
consultant.
temas
who has been tasked with working in this area of clinical trials with special emphasis on these insurance policies. So I would like, and contracts, I would like to invite him to address this topic specifically. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Perdón, voy a dejar de compartir
So
y
I
te
will
invito a tomar la
invite
palabra.
you
Gracias.
now to go
Bueno,
ahead.
muy buenos días, muy
Well,
buenas
good
tardes.
morning, good
Mi
afternoon.
agradecimiento, Carla,
First of all,
Sara,
Carla,
Julio
Sara,
Pérez, en haberme
I want to
convocado para esta
thank you
tarea.
for inviting me
Tarea que, como
to
bien dijo
address
Carla, está
this
apuntando a ver cómo
workshop.
logramos
We're
aunar
looking at
esfuerzos,
exactly how we
unificar
can
y
bring together
estandarizar en la
efforts, how
región un
can we help
aspecto que suele ser bastante
standardize an
conflictivo,
area that
vinculado a
sometimes
los
is subject to
contratos y a las
conflicts, looking
pólizas
at contracts as
Bien.
well as insurance policies in
Particularmente
this
hay que tener en
specific area.
cuenta
Well, first of all, we
la
need to be
importancia que
aware
tiene el régimen
of the
contractual en materia de
significance
ensayos clínicos
of
es de
the
capital
contract
importancia
regimes that
que podemos
govern
tener la
clinical
evaluación
trials.
aparte en un comité de ética, que sí
We
podemos
could
tener la
have an
aprobación
evaluation of
de
the
parte de
ethics
las autoridades
committees,
regulatorias,
approval by
como si el
regulatory
contrato de
authorities.
investigación
But
clínica
despite all
no
that,
se
if
firma,
the research
entonces allí tenemos
is
un problema
contract has not been
y
formally
obviamente
signed,
todos
that we
nuestros
have an
esfuerzos
issue and
habrán
all of
sido en
our
vano.
efforts have gone
Yo voy a hacer
for
una
naught.
presentación
So
de lo
I'm
que ha
going to
sido el
begin
trabajo de
this
esta consultoría.
presentation just to
Yo
discuss the
quiero
efforts
agradecer a los
undertaken by
colegas,
this
particularmente Cindy Pulgarín
consultation
y María
unit.
de Los Ángeles
I'd like to thank
Barrabás,
Maria Los
Cindy de Colombia y
Angeles,
María Los Ángeles de
Maria
México,
Los Angeles from
quien me han
Mexico,
aportado información
and
en su
Dr.
momento
Vargas, who
sobre
have
el
provided
régimen de
information
contratos y el
regarding the
régimen también
contract regimes
regulatorio
as well as
de
the
las
regulatory
investigaciones clínicas
regimes
en
governing
Colombia y en
clinical
México.
trials
Bien.
in
Bueno,
Colombia.
estamos
And
acostumbrados en los
we
comités de
are
ética a hablar
in
de
the ethics committees,
contratos
we're used to
CTA, que son
talking
los
about the
contratos de traslado de muestras biológicas,
CTA.
CTA, que son los contratos
We
de
have
traslado
the
de datos, de transferencia de
contracts that
datos, y
include
ahora
the
aparecen
transfer
los
of
CTA, que son
information and data,
justamente
and now
los
we have
contratos de
a
investigación clínica. Una
CTA governing
característica fundamental
clinical
es que estos
trials. So
contratos son muchísimo más
these
abarcativos
trials are
porque
much, or these
contemplan
contracts are
cuestiones
much more
vinculadas a lo que es el
encompassing
manejo de los
because they
datos,
look
la
at
logística del
data
estudio, el desarrollo del
management,
estudio,
studies,
pero también
research,
es crucial
logistics,
en este
but we
tipo de
also
contratos
look
algunos
at
aspectos vinculados
some
a
specific
la
areas
indemnización, la
associated with
reparación por lesiones, el
compensation
régimen de
for
responsabilidad
any
civil, el régimen de
injuries,
cobertura de gastos
as
que
well as
sabemos
civil
en base a los consensos
liabilities. And we
éticos
know that based
internacionales
on international
corresponden que sean
consensus,
asignados
they
a
need
el
to be
patrocinante del evento. Sabemos también que
attributed
entra
to
un grado
the
de responsabilidad
sponsors. Now,
profesional de parte de los
also a level
investigadores y de
of
los centros de
professional
investigación
responsibilities
y
and
podemos decir que es un
liabilities.
acuerdo
And we can
que se
say
firma
that
entre
this is
varias
an
partes, que
agreement signed among
generalmente
several
incluye al
parties that
patrocinador, a la
include
institución, al
sponsors,
equipo de investigación y
organizations,
a
the
veces a una
research
CRO o una organización de
units.
investigación de contrato, donde
And
se plasman
when
todas
we
las
look at these
obligaciones que no se
contracts,
agotan
we include
exclusivamente en
all the
cuestiones financieras, en
obligations that are
cuestiones de
not just
responsabilidad por
limited
daños,
to
porque allí
injury
también se van a plasmar
liability
aquellas
or
obligaciones provienen
monetary
de la buena práctica
responsibilities.
en
We also
investigación
have
que
those
surgen del protocolo, pero que
responsibilities that come from
volcadas en un
best
contrato
practices and
se va a traducir
protocols,
en
but
una
in a
exigencia
contract
legal.
are
Por eso decimos que el
translated in,
protocolo
again,
puede servir como base del
liabilities for
contrato y se lo
injuries.
considera un
So
elemento esencial,
these
un documento
are
esencial
considered
dentro de las
essential
SH,
documents within
porque particularmente
the
el contrato permite
organization
la
because the
evaluación de la ejecución
contract
del estudio,
enables
la
the
calidad de los datos producidos, porque
quality
en la
of
medida en
data
la cual nos
produced, because
ajustamos
as
a
we
cláusulas
adjust
contractuales
to
vinculados a el
those
desarrollo
areas
del estudio
associated
y el
with
manejo de
studies
los datos,
development,
la
data
calidad de los
management,
datos
the
va a ser
quality of the
mucho
data
mayor, ¿no?
will be
Entonces, ¿cuál es
much
la
more enhanced.
justificación para la existencia de
So
los
what's the
CTA y este
justification
tipo de contratos de
for the
investigación
existence
clínica?
of
Por un
these
lado,
CTA, which
tenemos
are
patrocinantes
uh,
responsables del diseño
clinical
que financian un estudio, que
research
invierten en
agreements?
desarrollo,
Basically,
investigadores
it
responsables con
research
conocimiento del
involves
área, quienes son responsables
researchers who are
profesionalmente
responsible with
por las
knowledge in the
acciones que
area,
van a realizar en
responsible
el
for the
ensayo
actions
clínico,
they will be taking,
instituciones en las
doing
cuales se
in the
desarrolla el
clinical trials,
estudio,
the
que de
institutions
acuerdo a
where
todo lo
the study
consensuado
takes
internacionalmente
place, and
deben
which,
tener el
according to all international
equipamiento y los
agreements, must
recursos
have the proper
necesarios para el
equipment and
desarrollo de
resources
investigación, el
necessary
desarrollo de
for
una molécula con
the
posibles
trial,
consecuencias
the
riesgosas para los
development of
participantes
possible
y
consequences
participantes
for
voluntarios que
participants
pueden sufrir
and community
consecuencias
participants
nocivas
who may
por
suffer
participar en el
consequences
estudio.
or
Entonces, el
losses for
CTA es el
participating
instrumento
in the
jurídico que
study.
permite
So
delimitar
the CTA is a
responsabilidades,
legal
régimen
document
de
that allows
indemnidad,
you to limit
costos y respetar
responsibilities,
todos aquellos
liability,
aspectos
costs,
éticos
and
y
cover
legales
all
que tienen que
ethical and
ver
legal
con el
aspects
desarrollo
that
de un
have to
estudio
do
y
with
no
the development
part of the trial and becomes it and converts it into an agreement. It almost serves as a guide. You see here the relationship as the link between the various participants in a research project. If you look at the bottom of the table, you see the subjects, the participants who are involved in the research through informed consent provided by the institution and the researchers, investigators. And then the link between the institution and investigator depends on the employment contract between the investigating team and the institution, which is not something we're going to look at today. And then at the top, we have the link between the sponsor, the institution, and the investigators that is done through the clinical trial agreement, the CTA. Obviously, if we look at the bottom and top of the chart, everything that is guaranteed, promised, assured through informed consent has to be reflected at the top in the CTA by specifying the parties that are binding to this type of agreement and therefore the importance of establishing proper criteria within the contract. So moving on to responsibility, the patient receives information about the coverage of damages through informed consent. There are also the costs, and then there must be a correspondence between the information given to the patient, the rights guaranteed, and the content of the contract. In other words, who assumes these obligations to inform the patient? And that creates indemnity to the other parties. For instance, the sponsor will be responsible for any harm and protects the research and institution. The other thing is the patient does not participate in the contract. He doesn't sign it. That's why he's exonerated from things that affect a third party. You could have total exoneration of liability to the detriment of the patient is not possible. And it's also liability that will involve coverage in relation to damages and expenses generated by the study, because these studies must be done with zero cost for the participant. And when the direct and indirect costs of the research in terms of any possible harm or damage. So in the contract, we will guarantee effective compliance with clear responsibility for each of the parties that has a responsibility. I'm not talking about the responsibility for harm, because if we observe what the CCP standards establish as responsibility of the research team and everyone involved in the study, then obviously this has to be clearly reflected in the contract, and each of these obligations has to be assigned. For instance, you cannot begin a clinical trial without the authorization of the National Regulatory Authority. That is usually a clause included in the CTA. So all of the obligations required by the GCP are a reflection of a clause in the contract that is not limited only to things relating to cost, harms, and possible harm. So the question then is, what is the relationship between a CTA and the GCP standards? Is it part of the agreed financial agreements and provisions for compensation or reparation of damages to participants? Why is it essential to address these contractual aspects for the development of well-designed research? As Carla was saying, if you look, for instance, at what has been established by the ICH in Standard E6R2, it mentions the need for contracts, and in the case of insurance, on an optional basis as established by current law. In other words, the standard is telling us that there's a need, and the essential nature of the clinic CTA is very clear. But in terms of insurance, it leaves it up to the current law, which allows for the possibility of other types of guarantees that are not necessarily an insurance policy. But we know that in practice, insurance contracts tend to be much more efficient when covering damages. The financial aspects of the trial must be documented in a contract. That's what the standard states. And in the event of trial-related injuries, the sponsors and policies and procedures should cover the cost of treatment of trial subjects in accordance with the applicable law. And this is considered an essential document. Now, in terms of the insurance and GCP standards, it indicates that if required by current legislation, the sponsor should take out insurance or indemnify the investigator or institution. It must be either legal or financial coverage. Legal one should protect the research team for any malpractice or negligence claims. And the financial one should provide effective coverage for the cost. In this way, the investigator and the institution are not liable either by insurance, if the law requires, or by a contractual clause that grants this. That's why it's very important that it's not enough to have an insurance policy. It's also important to have an agreement where there is an indemnity clause where the main person responsible is the sponsor. The direct attribution is given to them, particularly for those aspects where the insurance policy may not cover it. Now, in the document of the Americas, another one that we worked on for harmonization purposes, in addition to reiterating what the ICH standard says, it says the agreement should include evidence of acceptance by the institutions or hospital for the provision of the facilities and services and payment proposed by the sponsor. So here, we're not only interested in saying the indemnity regime and the cost regime, but also should state that the facilities are appropriate for the study. So it's giving us an idea of what else needs to be included in this contract. And it should specify in writing any task or function to be transferred to and assumed by an ICO, or all of this should be specified in writing, and any study-related tasks and functions not specifically transferred to and assumed by the ICO will be exercised by the sponsor. Now, let me summarize the harmonization of the instruments. And the reference to financial costs, responsibility for damages, the studies by the ICO, and responsibility in case of malpractice, because you have to differentiate that from the insurance of the sponsor, who will provide the supplies, and the research center. And the policy in both instruments put the option depending on the legal system in the country. Also, both documents state that insurance is not the only form of indemnity. It will often depend on the legal framework, but it does state that this is an essential document that have a CTA prior to or during the development of the trial. So we need to conclude, therefore, that we are in favor of clinical practices in the region. We need to agree on how to develop it. That's why, as Carla was saying, with the 75th World Health Assembly resolution was adopted, WHA 75.8, that urges countries to implement measures to improve the development of clinical trials. And one of the strategies was to comply with these precepts, is to conduct an analysis of the legal frameworks and regulatory provisions to strengthen clinical trials and improve the quality and coordination of research. That's why the clinical trial contracts, the CTAs, reflect clear obligations regarding responsibilities for supplies, damages, compliance with good research practices, compliance with the legal regime in force in each country, and the schedule of payments for the research, because that's not an insignificant portion of this type of research. And also what should be the payment for the research teams and the institutions involved. The regional channel that WHO proposed was to establish an objective to achieve harmonization in relation to the requirements to be met by an ATC. And for this purpose, legal provisions regarding ATCs and insurance in CTAs, rather, in insurance are were looked at in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru. Here, I am just going to give you a summary because we've analyzed all the standards. That's why I thank the two colleagues in Colombia and Mexico. And we have even included in Brazil the latest law, 14874 of 2024, which states that in contracts, it's a bit more advanced than what they had before. And I would like to mention very briefly the regular situation, because to give details about what each country's contracts say would take too much time. But all CTAs do agree on the responsibilities for damages to participants, the costs, and the liabilities for contract performance. The fundamental framework becomes the GCP regime, as it is part of the good practice to cover for injuries and costs. And then, regardless of the legal regime in force in each country, because as you know, in the Americas, we have both legal systems that is civil law, Germanic Roman one, and then we have the common law system. So we have two different systems, but harmonization would be possible if all the GCP regime coincides with the mandatory standards in the countries that have Napoleonic law and the common law countries, and therefore it would be possible to attribute liabilities with the scope of the GCP rules. So if a country wishes to adhere to a very well-developed research regime under the GCP framework, then these kinds of contracts are viable. And the standards related to the countries analyzed adhere to a greater or lesser extent to the responsibilities and liability regime in the execution of studies indicated in the GCP standards. Not all are GCP compliant, but to a greater or lesser extent, they do comply. So we'd have to analyze each country to ensure that they do comply. So most of them, even though they haven't adhered to the GCP standards, abide by them. So all countries in the region have a regulatory frameworks analyzed and include the obligation of financing by the sponsor, that its sponsors liability for damages, and the contracting of insurance. In Argentina, we analyzed the laws of the country, and in that case, it doesn't talk about specific clauses, but it does establish that ethical committees have the obligation to evaluate a contract. And so it does have to evaluate the contracts, which is indirectly determining what kind of contracts should be included. In Brazil, they have emphasized the financial aspect of its scope, as well as insurance coverage. Law 14874 mentions the contract regime for all research, including the indemnity regime. Because in terms of contracts, that law talks about general research contracts, not just clinical trials. And it does include an indemnity structure that is very detailed, lays out the obligations of the sponsor and that of the investigator. So it does presumes indemnity is established. And this is an additional point, although it's not a specific clause, it's another point that adheres with what we're doing. In Chile, we work the focus on indemnity and insurance coverages and the financing regime, and the clinical trials emphasizing on the indemnity regime, financing regime. Colombia is a country that has more specific requirements regarding contracts through the guide for INVIMA committees, and it attributes the functions of the committees, and it verifies their financial protocols and includes resolutions referring to good clinical practices more aligned in the sense.
In the case of Mexico, we've also been working on Mexican legislation that refers to obligations with regards to ethics committees, the general health legislation, the regulatory framework covering medical research, and the characteristic also includes the budget provisions, which needs to include availability of financial funds in addition to mechanisms to ensure continuity of medical treatment and care, as well as compensation, in particular those areas that include insurance. And in the decree there's a sound regime that is very detailed in the area of insurance and establishing the principle that we know in itself is fairly evident that beyond the insurance considerations, we also have the responsibilities assumed by the sponsors. And so regarding harmonization, looking at the ensuring that the parties involved in the contract all fulfill their responsibilities, civil responsibility for damages suffered. And in the study undertaken, this is taken from the regime on publications, intellectual property. It's interesting to see if we look at the public accountability in terms of the transfer of knowledge from research projects, transparency of the data. So if we look at the regional challenges in the field of insurance, looking at the policies, insurance policies that need to identify the coverage of damage that come from the negligence, and this is not from this responsibility. Not all legislation refers to or establishes obligatory responsibility. It depends on the negotiations between the parties. In addition to the, well, in the insurance, it's the responsibility of those contracting parties. And that's why it's important to understand that everything that's not included in the insurance needs to be covered by the parties who have contracted these services so that we can verify that clause, that reimbursement clause for damages in addition to the contract. So we have the responsibilities identified for each one of the parties. As we're concluding, there's more information regarding the insurance protecting the those insured and places the accent on the victim. Financial and legal indemnity assumed by the insurance, the costs of the damages to cover, and it's not always the same for all clinical trials. It depends on the act costs, and we look at the responsibility for insuring, and we identify those areas that require identifying the source of damages as well as identifying those responsible. In the case of malpractice, then the clinical trials may be used as evidence to identifying those responsibility. And then we also have the, although this clause doesn't have to do, this has to do with the contract freedoms, and this is not something that we're going to be addressing in this webinar. In the conclusions, the scenario in the development of drugs implies the presence of companies that invest in research, participants enrolled with the possible consequences for their health, institutions that place their facilities at the disposal of clinical trial, and appropriate researchers that are hired for developing the research. Signing these financial agreements or research contracts allow us to include the regime covering obligations among the parties as well as establishing the responsibility for compliance and liabilities. So the contracts have various legal aspects as well as financial, ethical considerations. The legal aspects are also part of the binding features of the implementation of the regime that is in force, that defining the costs, obligations of the parties, financial aspects that also seek just compensation for research units, and the assumption of the costs that need to be covered by the study. The ethics are assigned or linked to the ethical obligations assumed by the informed consent. So these are key considerations. In other words, the risk-benefit equation That is
Diríamos, lema sería mitigar los
our
riesgos de
main
investigación.
theme is to
Pero cuando
mitigate
los
the risks
riesgos
of
son
research. But when the
evidentes y son
risks are
conocidos, es
evident
la
and they're well
reputación,
known,
la
then
forma o la obligación ética
compensation
para poder
is the
contribuir en
ethical
algo a la salvaguarda
obligation
de los participantes.
to ensure
Y
the
esto
well-being
implica necesariamente
of and
un
protection
CPA
of the
que tenga
participants.
estas previsiones. Por
CTAs
último,
have to
entonces,
include
trabajar en un
these
modelo de contrato armonizado en
considerations.
términos
Therefore, we need to
permite otorgar
develop
mayor
a
seguridad al momento de
harmonized
patrocinio,
contract model
como
at
si
the
también
regional
con relación a
level
los
that can
estándares de
provide
protección de
greater
los
safety and
participantes.
security at the
Si
moment
nos
that
ponemos de
the
acuerdo en la
contractors
región sobre cómo
are
implementar y salvaguardar
following
derechos en
standards
los
of
contratos de
protection of
investigación
participants,
clínica,
avoiding
más allá de toda la cuestión operativa
diversity
vinculada a la
of
buena práctica
compliance
técnica,
standards and
habremos
guarantees
logrado
established among
entonces
the international
evitar
ethical
diversos
consensus
estándares en
regimes.
el cumplimiento
So
de las
we need to
garantías
make sure
establecidas en los
that
consensos éticos
we reflect these ethical
y
consensus.
muchas
And
gracias que nos permitan.
with that, I've concluded. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you,
Carlos, por esta,
Carlos,
no solamente por la presentación, sino
not
por
just
la
for your
investigación de base
presentation,
que
but
realizó
all
ese
of
día.
the
Quiero ahora
research
invitar
that
al
was
doctor
undertaken.
Hans Vázquez,
I'd now like to invite
que
Dr.
quizás
Hans
algunos lo
Vasquez.
recuerdan de alguna sesión previa.
I'm sure you remember him
Él
from
es
some
médico de
previous sessions.
formación,
He's
tiene
a
una
physician
maestría en salud
and
pública
he has a
con
master's in public
especialización en
health with
epidemiología.
specialization in
Él ha sido jefe
epidemiology.
del Instituto
He was
Nacional
the
de Salud
director
y
of the
director de la
National
Oficina de
Institute of Health and
Investigación del
director
Instituto
of
Nacional de
Medical
Salud
Research at
Perú,
the National
que
Health
es la
Institutes
entidad
of
que tiene a
Peru,
su
which is an
cargo la
organization
regulación
that
de
is
los
tasked
ensayos clínicos
with
en Perú,
regulating
la
clinical
supervisión ética de la
trials
investigación en
in
general.
Peru and
El
research,
doctor
medical research
Vázquez
in general.
actualmente trabaja en una
Dr.
organización sin
Vasquez
fines de lucro,
works right now in a
implementa
nonprofit
ensayos
organization that
clínicos en
implements
VIH, en tuberculosis y otras
the clinical trials in
infecciones
tuberculosis,
relacionadas.
HIV, and related
Y estos son ensayos
infections.
que son
And these are
patrocinados
clinical
por
trials
los
supported
institutos
by
nacionales de
the
salud de los
National
Estados
Institutes
Unidos
of Health of
y
the
es
United
además
States.
profesor de
He is
posgrado de la
also a
Universidad
graduate
Peruana Cayetano.
professor at the University
Él nos
of
va
Peru.
a compartir
So he's
sus,
going to share
sus
his
reflexiones en
reflections
relación a la
relating to
presentación del doctor Burger.
Dr. Berger's
Bueno,
presentation.
quiero resaltar que tanto
I also want to
Hans como
highlight both
Carlos
Hans as well
estuvieron
as
en el
Carlos.
taller
They
inicial
participated in the first workshop
en Brasilia
held in
que
Brasilia
generó
that
esta reflexión y
led
esta
to
necesidad de un
the
trabajo armonizado en este tema.
conclusions
Adelante, Hans.
that there was a need for harmonizing these standards.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Carla,
Well, first of all, thank you, Carla, for those words of introduction.
Gracias a OPS por la
I'd like to
invitación
thank
a
PAHO
este
for
webinar.
kindly inviting me to participate in this webinar.
Gracias a ti también, Carlos,
I want to
por la
thank you,
presentación tan
Carlos,
completa
for
que has
this
tenido.
very comprehensive
Y
presentation.
voy a hacer algunos comentarios
And
generales.
I'm just
¿no?
going to share
En
some
general,
general comments.
no sé qué más
Overall,
decir de lo que
I
ha
don't know
comentado
what
Carlos.
else to
Realmente ha
say
sido una
beyond what Carlos
presentación
has already
completa
covered.
sobre
I thought
este
it was
tema tan
a very thorough
complejo de abordar y
and
que tiene
complete
muchas aristas, ¿no? Y cada país lo
complete
está trabajando de
presentation that
manera
has many
diferente en
nuances,
general de acuerdo a
and
sus
each region or country is
regulaciones, a sus
working
acuerdos
based on its own
administrativos
administrative
y aspectos
agreements
legales que rigen
as
cada
well as
país.
legal regimes in each country.
Como decía Carla al
As
inicio,
Carla said at the outset,
todo lo que motiva esto es la
what really
resolución del
spurs this on
2022
is
que busca
Resolution
tener más
2022
y
that
mejores
seeks
ensayos
to
clínicos que respondan a las
improve the
necesidades de nuestros
quality of
países.
clinical
Y
trials that more
en ese
effectively
contexto del
respond to
cual
the
quiero
needs of
comentar
our countries. And that's
brevemente lo que
just
ha
something
dicho
I
Carlos.
wanted to briefly add to what Carlos has
Sabemos bien
already pointed out. We
que
know
los aspectos
that
claves
the
en
key
este contexto
aspects in this
y
context,
recogiendo
and
lo
just
último que
to
decía Carlos es que
follow
los
up on the
contratos
last comments by
tienen que haber de
Carlos,
todas
we know that
maneras en el
contracts
marco de la
need
implementación de los ensayos clínicos,
within,
¿no?
they need to be closely
Así como aspectos
aligned with
claves que mandan
all
las
of the
buenas prácticas
follow-up of
clínicas
the clinical
para la
trials. In
implementación de
addition
los
to the
ensayos
best
clínicos
practices
es la
for
protección de
clinical
los
trials, we also need
participantes,
to be able
que el
to
recojo de los
ensure the
datos y la
protection
información sea
and
adecuado.
safeguard the
Los
interests of
países han
participants.
recogido también
And
regulaciones
countries have now
que responden,
included
en el caso de Perú,
regulations or created
y recogen
regulations that
las buenas prácticas
respond
clínicas
and also take
recomendadas a nivel
the
internacional,
international best practices
incluyendo la
into
Organización Mundial de la
their
Salud y los
fold,
documentos
including the
que han
WHO
publicado
best
también la
practices
Organización
and
Panamericana
documents
de la Salud.
published
Y en
by the
ese
Pan American
contexto se
Health
establecen
Organization. In that
responsabilidades,
context, the
responsabilidad del
responsibilities
investigador,
by the
del patrocinador,
researcher,
de la
the
organización de investigación por
organization
contrato,
that
que
is
es el
contracting these
intermediario, y
services, the
diferentes actores, ¿no?
intermediaries, and
Y
various
se deben
other
establecer claramente
stakeholders.
las
And we need to
delegaciones
clearly
de
establish
responsabilidades
the
entre todos
assigning
estos actores
of responsibilities, clearly delineating
y la
those
manera en el cual se
responsibilities
tiene
for
que
each one of the
establecer esto
individual
es a
stakeholders. And the way
través de
you
los
do
contratos.
this is
Muchos de
through
nuestros países
contracts. In many
lo
of
han
our
recogido
countries,
en las
they've encompassed
regulaciones
this,
y
they've
en su
included
norma
it
de manera
in their
específica, tal que los
regulatory
contratos, por
practices
ejemplo, en
and
el caso de Perú
standards.
y otros
Contracts
países
in
de la
Peru, for
región,
example, and other countries in the region
recogen básicamente lo
have
que dice
encompassed
la
what
regulación del país,
the
¿no?
country
Donde
regulations
de manera
establish,
específica en
where
muchos casos se establecen
specifically, in many cases,
aspectos específicos de
we have
responsabilidades
specific
de los
areas of
patrocinadores, de los
responsibility, liability
investigadores,
assumed by
de las
the
organizaciones de
researchers,
investigación por contrato
the
y todos
research
los que
organizations that are contracted, those
son
who are
responsables de la
responsible
implementación de los
for
ensayos clínicos,
implementing the
inclusive de
clinical
las
trials,
instituciones,
and in particular those
hospitales y
organizations,
establecimientos públicos o
hospitals,
privados donde
public,
se
private
desarrolla el ensayo
health
clínico.
facilities where
Incluso
clinical trials are taking place. In fact, many
de los hospitales
Many of the
o de los
hospitals
establecimientos públicos o
and
privados hay
public and private
diferentes
sector
centros de
establishments
investigación.
have various
Y en ese
research
sentido,
departments,
muchos de nuestros países,
and
como en el
many
caso de
of our
Perú,
countries,
se
such
ha
as in the case of
recogido
Peru,
de alguna
have,
manera
to
en
a
la
certain
regulación la
extent,
corresponsabilidad de la institución
encompass the concept of a co-responsibility by the organizations
de estar velando
to
por
be
los aspectos
safeguarding
relacionados a la
those
protección de los participantes
areas,
y que la información se
reflecting the
recoja de manera
protections
adecuada dentro de
and
la normativa propia de
the
los
health and
establecimientos
safety
públicos
of
y
those
privados,
participants in
¿no?
both
que
private and
existen.
public sector institutions.
Algunos, además
Some,
de los
in
países como el
addition
Perú, por ejemplo, se
to
exige
countries
una
like
póliza,
Peru,
que es una
where
póliza de
we
responsabilidad civil, como
require
decía Carlos
a
muy
policy
bien,
of
que cubre
civil
diferentes aspectos, y
liability,
no solo los
looking at
financieros, sino
various
también
areas,
de
not just
responsabilidad. Y hay diferentes
responsibility,
modalidades de
financial
contrato,
responsibilities, but
no
others,
solo
and looking
en
at the
cuanto al contenido,
contract
¿no?
structure. Not only the
También es
content
importante
is something we
señalar
look at, but we also need to point out
la diferencia en cuanto a la
the
modalidad, ¿no?
differences
No
in
solo es
terms
importante de
of
alguna manera
modalities. It's
uniformizar
not
los
just
contenidos, sino
crucial that we
o en todo
standardize the
caso emitir
content,
recomendaciones
or at least
mínimas
issue
en cuanto a
minimum
características y modalidades de
recommendations
contrato, porque hay
regarding
contratos
the
con la
specific
institución de
characteristics, formats
investigación,
of contracts. We have
con el
contracts
grupo de
signed with
investigadores, hay
research
contratos
units,
tripartitos, hay diferentes
researchers,
modalidades de contratos
tripartite
en nuestros
contracts.
países,
There
¿no?
are various
Tanto
categories of contracts
como da soporte
that
nuestra
also provide
burocracia, digamos,
support to
y
our
aspectos
bureaucratic
legales
and
que
legal
existen en nuestros países,
requirements
que a
that
veces
exist in our
están
countries,
desarrollados más
sometimes have been developed
para la
more
atención
focused on
pública, para la práctica clínica y
for
para la
clinical
investigación. Están muy poco
practices and
desarrollados, ¿no?
research
Entonces, y es
purposes.
así
These
que
are
las instituciones
less well
y el
developed.
mismo sector
So,
público, las instituciones privadas y
institutions,
públicas,
public and
se
private
ven
sector
en la
institutions
necesidad
have found the
de
need
crear y
to
tratar de englobar
create and try
ordenamientos que
to
permitan el
provide
desarrollo
innovations
adecuado
in structuring
de
adequately
los ensayos clínicos,
the
¿no? De tal
clinical
manera
trials processes so that
que incentive
we
cada
provide
vez más y mejores
incentives
ensayos clínicos, pero a la vez
for increasingly
estos
improved, better
permitan
clinical
proteger de
trials
manera
that
adecuada a los
in
participantes,
turn
que se
also
recojan los
provide
datos de
those
manera adecuada,
safeguards and
etcétera, ¿no?
protections
Como
for
decía también
those
Carlos, y me
parties
pareció muy
involved.
importante, es que los
One thing
contratos
that
y
Carlos
estos
also mentioned, I
ordenamientos
think, is very
jurídicos
important, and these
responden
contracts and legal
en
provisions
concreto
respond
a lo que
specifically
establece el
to
protocolo,
what the
responde a la
protocol
ciencia, ¿ok? Y lo que
establishes. It
empuja todo esto es la
responds to the
ciencia,
science.
que se
Science is
plasma en un
really the
protocolo.
driver
Y del
behind
protocolo
all of
se
this, which is
generan los
then
contratos. Los
interpreted
contratos no
in
salen del aire.
protocols.
Entonces,
Contracts don't
es
just come out of
importante
thin
que los
air. That's why it's
contratos
essential that
recojan los
contracts,
aspectos generales,
again,
pero también de
encompass
alguna
not
manera
just the
llevan
general
la
considerations,
especificidad
but
los
also
aspectos
specific
propios de los
and
protocolos, ¿no?
those areas directly related
Eh,
to the
y hasta
protocols.
aquí quiero comentar
So I also want
brevemente
to
los aspectos
mention
que Carlos ha
some of
tocado.
those areas
Me
covered by
parece que el tema de los
Carlos. I think
contratos es necesario,
contract in
que
the
el
looking
tema
at
de la
contracts,
póliza
we also
cada
need
país lo
to look
está
at
generando de
how
manera,
each individual
digamos,
country is
particular. En el caso del
developing
Perú, por
and
ejemplo, aparte de lo que
creating
Carlos
their own
señalaba, los
policies
ordenamientos de la
and
póliza,
looking at in
también en el
Peru, for example,
reglamento
in
está la
according to
obligación de que el
standards and
patrocinador cuente con
regulations,
un fondo de
the
atención inmediata. Es
the
decir, no solo en la
sponsor
póliza, sino un fondo de
has to
atención inmediata
provide a
de manera
fund for
obligatoria
immediate
que
care.
permita cubrir
In the
los
policy, this can
problemas
cover
inmediatos
immediate problems that may arise
ante cualquier problema de un
in the
participante y esto
face of any
usualmente está
issues
en los
that are
contratos.
encountered by the
Básicamente
parties
eso es lo que
involved.
quería
That's
comentar
already
de manera
stipulated
inicial.
in the contract. That's just a couple of things I wanted to mention.
Muchísimas
Well,
gracias
thank you.
a Hans por
Thank
tus
you, Hans,
reflexiones. Quiero
for those
ahora
remarks.
invitar a Adriel
Now,
Reutemann, él es
I would
abogado,
like
es asesor
to
legal de la
invite
Dirección General de
Adriel
Docencia,
Reutemann, who's a legal
Investigación y
advisor
Desarrollo
working in
Profesional del
research and
Ministerio de
professional
Salud de la
development at the
Gran Ciudad de
Ministry of
Buenos
Health
Aires.
of
Es
Buenos
miembro
Aires,
de los
Argentina.
comités de
He's a
ética de la
member of the
investigación
ethic committees
de la
governing
Clínica y Maternidad
research, clinical
Suizo-Argentina y
trials
Clínica
in
Olivos,
Argentina,
y es miembro ad hoc
at
del
the
Comité
clinical
Central de Ética y
laboratory in
Investigación del
Olivos,
Ministerio de
and at
Salud de
the
Buenos
director
Aires.
of the research
Adriel ha
department
estado
at the
trabajando como
University of Buenos
consultor de la
Aires. He's
OPS
also been a
también
consultant
en estos
at
proyectos
PAHO
que
in these
quiero adelantar. El
projects. And
objetivo
let
de
me
la
just mention
OPS
that the
es
objective of PAHO
proponer a la
is to
región
propose
sobre la
for
base
consideration by the
de un
region an
análisis,
analysis,
del análisis que les ha presentado a
the
Carlos,
analysis that Carlos has
del
already
panorama
discussed,
regional
the
y a la
overall
luz de los estándares internacionales,
landscape,
proponer
and
una
in
versión
the light of international
estandarizada de
standards,
protocolos y
propose
pólizas de
a
seguro.
resolution
Entonces,
that will standardize
quiero
insurance
invitar a
policy. So I'd
Adriel
like to
para que
invite
modere la
Adriel. He's
sesión
going to
del día de hoy
moderate
y quiero
today's
invitar
session.
también,
I'd also like to
además de
invite,
moderar el diálogo, bueno,
in
el diálogo
addition
con los
to
demás,
serving as
con,
moderator
con Carlos y con Hans, y quiero
with
invitarles
Carlos and
a
Hans,
prender su cámara.
I'd like you
También
to
le
just
doy la
turn on your
palabra
cameras,
a
please.
Adriel.
And I'd like to offer the floor to Adriel.
Bien, muchas gracias, Carla.
Thank you,
Gracias a
Carla.
Carlos, a Hans, a Sara, a
Thanks
todos los que
to
son parte
Carlos,
de este
Hans,
webinar.
all of those that have
Hay
joined
muchas
the
preguntas.
webinar. There are many
Habitualmente, los
questions,
abogados que trabajamos en
and
salud
the
estamos
attorneys
acostumbrados a
that
hacer
work in the
nosotros lo que no
health
entendemos sobre
arena,
lo que hablan los
not
demás. Y
only
ahora
do
se
we need to
invirtió
understand what
esa
these
carga, con lo cual nos ponen en
professionals
un lugar de
are talking
preferencia.
about, and I
Yo
think this
quisiera
has
empezar
now
con una
placed us in a
pregunta
privileged position. I'd
que
like to start off with a question
puede ser para Carlos,
that
puede ser para Hans,
could be
incluso
for
para Carla
Carlos,
también,
for
sobre
Hans,
cuál
for
es el rol
Carla,
que
as
creen
to the
que
role that you
debería tener el
believe
Comité de Ética e
that
Investigación
the
en la
Research
evaluación
Ethics
de
Committee
los
should
contratos y de las
play in
pólizas de
terms of
seguro. Y en tal
assessments
caso,
and contracts as well
quizás
as
el más
insurance
orientado para
policies.
Carlos es
And this is more
cuáles son las
focused to
experiencias
Carlos.
en los
What are
diferentes
some of the
lugares de la región
experiences that
respecto
you
a
have
esto.
gleaned in different parts of the region associated with
Bueno,
these
es un
key
tema,
challenges? Well,
tamaño tema,
you've
porque
given me just a little
nos
to chew
encontramos con
on
una
there, right? But we
situación un
find
poco diversa,
a
podríamos decir,
very
¿no?
we see great
Argentina se le permite
differences.
más
Argentina
responsabilidad,
is
le
the
han puesto los
country
comités
that
de
has
ética
assigned
en el
most
tema de
most
contratos a
responsibility in
través de
terms
la
of
resolución
contract
480/11 que
and
ellos han
looking
puesto
at
acción.
the
Esto ha
legislation
generado a
10
veces un poco
11,
de
and
controversia en el
this has
comité para
generated
saber
a certain
hasta qué
amount of
punto
controversy in
puede
the committees to
involucrarse el
understand to
comité
what
de ética,
extent does
sobre
the
todo
ethics
porque muchas
committee
veces
become
contratos
involved,
existen de
because in many
negociaciones
contract areas it
institucionales
depends
con
on
patrocinantes y el comité de
negotiations
ética
between
está fuera
institutions
de
with
ese ámbito de
sponsors, and
negociación,
the
¿no?
ethics committee is
En el caso de
outside of that
Argentina, esta resolución
area
establece
of
más o menos son
responsibility.
8 o 9
Now,
puntos
in
básicos en los
Argentina, we
cuales
have
el
8 to
comité debe
9
tener
key points that
injerencia.
the
Es
committee
interesante
needs to
tratar
become
de ver si
involved in.
debería seguir
So
siendo así,
we are
porque en
discussing whether
realidad
this
esto
needs
le
to
implica al
continue as
comité
such,
una
because it's the
carga
committee's policy
evaluatoria que
to
quizás, no lo
assess,
sabemos,
and we're not
podría
fully
corresponder
apprised that this
más
could
a un área de
be
gestión de conocimiento de
that
las
could be
instituciones,
more
a un ámbito de
related
negociación de
to
otro
the
tipo,
area
inclusive en
of
OPS
research and
ya se ha realizado
knowledge.
un
And we know
encuentro
that
en su
the
momento con
PAHO,
otros
we've
modelos, ¿no?
seen
Sobre todo en los
discussions on
CTA o
other
los DTA, donde
models
por ahí
with
el
the
comité de ética
CTAs.
podía dar
The
un
ethics
visado ok,
committee
pero en
could
realidad toda
give
la
the
parte de
okay, but
negociación y
it's really the
evaluación pura de un
negotiating
contrato
parties
correspondería a otras
that
áreas. De todos
would,
los países de la región,
these
el
would be
que
the
más
areas of
le ha
their
dado
responsibility.
responsabilidades a esto ha
Those
sido
focuses have been
la
mainly
Argentina.
placed
Bien,
by
después vemos el
Argentina.
caso, por ejemplo, de
Then we can
Colombia,
look
de
at the case
México,
of
donde
Colombia,
establece pautas muy
and
generales
that
que tendríamos
established
que tener en
very
cuenta, sobre todo
broad
para la cobertura
broad standards and procedures. I think one thing that Hans mentioned, in the case of Peru, there's this fund that's been established that the organizer has to use to provide immediate medical care. And it has to do with that responsibility for injuries suffered from the outset. And the insurance would then provide additional support. And it's interesting what Hans discusses here, because that has to do with a clause that talks about potential injuries that this fund needs to cover in order to satisfy that level of responsibility, and it's encompassed in a contract, as the standards and procedures already stipulate in Peru, that in addition to the insurance, you have the responsibilities by the sponsor. And this is something we've been discussing at PAHO within the contract, the model that we're seeking to include this provision. So the ethics committee could perhaps play a much more straightforward role, because if the ethics committee, amongst other institutions, is moved by the benefits and costs equation, then they should have this responsibility for covering and providing that coverage. But, and I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but this is something that needs to be looked at. But it's Argentina where we've assigned a great deal of responsibility on these parties.
Gracias, Carlos. Yo quería
Thank you,
complementar, digamos,
Carlos.
creo que es
I
bueno
wanted to
tener un
add
análisis de qué
something,
hacemos
because I think it's
qué
good to have an
deberíamos hacer.
analysis of
Y
what we are doing
tener la
and what
claridad
we
que
should be
muchas
doing,
veces
and
en este tema y en
have
otros
clarity
temas en nuestra
that
región,
very often
manejamos las
on this
cosas con lo
topic
que
and other
podemos.
topics in our
¿Ok?
region,
Tenemos una
we
situación
do
difícil y
things with what
buscamos
we have.
soluciones
We have
según
difficult
lo que
situations
hay.
and we
¿Quiénes
find a
están sentados en
solution
la mesa?
based
¿Quiénes
on
pueden asumir
what
responsabilidades?
we have.
¿Quiénes tienen
Who
el
is around the
compromiso?
table?
Etcétera,
Who
etcétera.
will assume responsibilities?
Pero
Who
esas
has made the
soluciones,
commitment, et cetera, et cetera.
en respuesta a
But
la necesidad,
those
no siempre,
solutions
y lo sabemos, no
to
es que sea ninguna
a need
sorpresa, son soluciones en
are,
respuesta a la
as
necesidad.
we all know,
No
are
son
only solutions in
soluciones
response to a
sobre
need.
lo
They
que
are
debiera
not
ocurrir. Un
solutions
comité
about
de
what
ética
should actually
no,
occur.
no
An
tiene
ethics committee does
la
not
pericia,
have the
la
expertise,
experiencia, el
the
entrenamiento
experience, the
para
training
abordar temas
to
de
cover
contratos
or
legales.
address
Por supuesto,
topics
hay un aspecto de la
pertaining to
dimensión
legal contracts. Of course, there is an ethical dimension to it. There are ethical obligations included in the contract, but to actually review a contract, that is the function of a legal expert. And although it may be true that in countries such as Argentina and other countries in the region, that review is the responsibility of ethics committees, that's a solution based just on need, because there really should be legal experts in institutions that give a legal review, that check legally the contract, because an ethics committee doesn't have the training to do that. If you look at the guidelines, they just look at the protocols of information and informed consent, etc. We always talk about a system of ethics in research. You look at to make sure something is done, but not necessarily does that mean that one is the one who does it. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind, because as our region moves towards being more rigorous, doing better clinical trials, well, then we're going to have to make sure that all the parts, all the pieces that are missing from our system, and I think we saw that, Carlos, when we were talking about the MPAs, the geotransfer agreements, we're going to have to now make sure that those missing pieces are filled in. So we're more professional, more consistent, because I imagine that many of you who are working on ethics committees are thinking, oh my God, now we're going to have to review and monitor, and now we're also going to become legal experts, which is, as I was saying, many of us are not. And nowhere in the document does it say that the person who has legal expertise and who's a member member of an ethics committee should have this additional extra job of doing that. That it's not at all in the international standards.
Sí,
Thank you.
bueno, ya dijeron todo.
Yeah,
Yo me iba a
well,
ir,
you said it all.
simplemente iba a comentar lo
think
que acaba de decir
I was
Carla.
just going to say what you just said, Carla.
Creo que
that
debiéramos pensar esto
I
como un
think we
sistema, ¿no?
have
Es
to
decir, no
think
todo
of
tiene
this
que hacer
as a system.
el comité
Not
de
everything has to
ética,
be done by the
digamos, a
ethics
veces
committee.
desde la perspectiva de quien regula. Yo no estoy ahora regulador,
From the
pero he
perspective
tenido la
of the
experiencia.
regulator,
Quisiera
I
que
am not a regulator
antes de
right
que
now,
llegue
but I
donde
do
el
have experience
regulador,
in that. I
me
think
llegue
that
bien y que el
before it
comité de
gets
ética
to
me
the
revise todo
regulator,
lo que yo también voy a
I
revisar,
would
¿no?
want the
Incluso, ¿no?
ethics committee to check
El
everything,
regulador tampoco
revise everything.
necesariamente va a
And
saber
also
los
the
contratos, ¿no?
regulator himself may not be the one that
Aunque lo
revises or
puede
reviews the
verificar en el
contracts.
caso de Perú, en
In the
las
case of
inspecciones
Peru,
siempre, ¿no?
they can do, they have the power to do
Pero
this when they perform an
me
inspection,
parece
but
que, y también los
I
comités de
don't
ética
think
no
that's a
suelen ver
responsibility. And
los
I
temas
also
de
think
contrato.
ethics
En todo
committees
caso,
don't
los
look at
comités que son
contracts.
acreditados para
At
ensayos
least the
clínicos
committees that
no
have been
suelen verlo,
accredited
¿no?
for clinical trials don't tend to look at the
Y eso es lo que
contracts.
puedo comentar.
And so that's my comment.
Bueno, a propósito del tema, en los
In
comentarios
terms of
están
the
diciendo que
various comments, one
ciertamente
comment
en la
has
región,
been that
los comités suelen
in
tener
the
un
region,
abogado.
committees
Por
do
ejemplo, en
tend to
Argentina
have
es
an
mandatorio
attorney.
tener un
In
abogado
Argentina,
en
for
el
instance, it's
comité.
mandatory to have an
Entiendo que hay alguna
attorney in
diversidad
the
entre los
ethics
diferentes
committee.
países, pero si
Now
no
I
es
realize there's
obligatorio,
difference
a
between
veces creen
different
que es
countries.
conveniente que
And so if
integremos
it's not
comités de ética en la
mandatory, at
investigación.
least it's advisable
Y
that there
muchas
be
veces
an
sucede
attorney in
que
the
el
research
mismo
committee,
abogado que integra el
in
comité de ética en
ethics committee.
investigación es
And
también
very
el abogado
often
en
the
institución
attorney
y
is
realiza con
the
ese doble
considered the
rol los
inclusion
aspectos legales en defensa de la
attorney who
institución
looks at
y los
both
aspectos
things from
éticos
both
legales, si se quiere,
perspectives,
del
the
comité.
ethical, legal, and the contract side.
¿Consideran que es
So,
adecuado ese
do you
formato?
think that this format is adequate, enough?
A ver,
What?
dale, Hans.
Go ahead, Hans.
No. Simplemente parto de la idea de que los
I would
comités
like to start with the premise that
siempre están
committees
preocupados
should
por la
and are
protección de
always
los
concerned
participantes,
about
¿ok? Y en
protecting the
ese sentido,
participants,
están muy preocupados por
and
el tema
they are
de la
very concerned
compensación,
about
están muy
questions of
preocupados por los requisitos,
compensation,
digamos, relacionados al
requirements,
balance beneficio-riesgo.
pertaining to risk-benefit balance.
Normalmente
So
no ven temas de
normally,
contrato.
they're not
Entiendo que
really looking at a
en algunos
contract.
países se
I
sabe
understand that in
tiene que haber
some
un abogado,
countries,
en otros
there
no
has
necesariamente,
to be
aunque
an
debe haber
attorney on the
pericia legal,
ethics
¿no?
committee,
Es un tema
although in
complicado. A ver,
others
Carla, te
it's
doy
not a
la
requirement,
palabra.
maybe legal
Sí,
expertise, but not an
efectivamente,
attorney.
un comité
Yes,
de ética no
an
está
ethics
ni
committee
situado,
is
ni
not
tiene la preparación, ni tiene el
prepared,
mandato de
doesn't have the
revisar
preparation, nor does
este
it have
tipo
the
de
mandate
documentos.
to
Que
review
se
this
haga, se
kind of
hacen
a
muchas
document.
cosas porque,
Yes, they do it,
porque
and they
cuando
do
no
lots of
hay
things
otros
because
recursos,
when there are no other
las cosas
resources,
se hacen.
you try to get things done.
Digamos, más que verlo en el sentido
But
como una crítica,
instead of looking at this as a
soluciones.
criticism,
Pero
let's
así
see
como
it
hemos
from the
buscado
perspective of
soluciones en
that we're
plazo
trying to find a
inmediato, tenemos
solution.
que buscar
But just
soluciones
as we
de
found
mediano y largo
short-term
plazo
resolutions, we
para
have to
hacer
find
ensayos clínicos de la mejor
long-term
manera.
solutions so
Y eso
that we
supone
do clinical
asegurar que
trials in the
el
best way
expertise por
possible.
fuera
And
del
that
comité de ética para
means
hacer
that the
estas,
expertise should
estas
be outside the
revisiones.
ethics committee, the
Un comité
expertise
tiene
for
que hacer un
reviewing a
análisis
contract,
ético,
because a
análisis
committee
de las
does
partes,
ethical
decisiones éticas
analysis
con
on
eso
the
y
basis of the
debiera
clauses
realmente
established by
contar con
SIOMS,
otros
and they
recursos,
should
otras,
have,
con otras
ideally,
oficinas, con otros
resources,
expertise,
others,
que,
experts, other
que
individuals
hagan esta
who
parte.
do
Esa parte
that
de la
part,
revisión.
the
Un
review of
comité
the
de ética no
contract.
es el
An
multitodo,
ethics
¿ok?
committee should not be a
Un comité de ética
multitask
tiene un
committee.
mandato
They have a
específico, una
specific
tarea
mandate,
específica,
a
una
very
obligación
specific task,
específica,
obligation,
y
and
hay cosas que escapan a su tarea.
there are things beyond
Nuevamente,
their
insisto,
purview.
como no
Again,
en la
let me
mayoría de nuestras
insist. Now, in
instituciones,
most of our
que hacer
institutions,
investigación
the
no está
practice of
suficientemente fortalecida,
research is
al
not
comité de
strong
ética
enough.
se le ha agregado
That's
una
why
lista de
the ethics
cosas
committee has been
que
given
van más allá de su
additional
mandato,
tasks,
de
but
su
those are
expertise,
outside
de
its
los
mandate,
estándares éticos
outside its
internacionales,
level of expertise,
pero
outside of the
debiéramos ver que
international
esas
standards.
tareas se
And
cumplan de la
we
mejor manera
do
por
need
fuera
to
del
make
comité
sure
de ética.
those tasks are done in the best way
Sí, por
possible,
ejemplo,
but outside the ethics
quizás,
committee.
quizás en
Well,
algunos países
perhaps in
la
some
regulación es tan
countries,
explícita
regulations are so explicit that contracts basically replicate what is stated in the legislation. For instance, in Peru, in terms of policies, it's very explicit. It's a legal requirement when they submit it, and the regulatory authority, as somebody said in the chat, the authority reviews the policy in great detail, great detail. So the policy has to abide by legal instructions on how policies are drafted generally. Now, maybe in other countries, regulations aren't as explicit, and maybe other regulatory or ethics bodies are therefore a kind of forced to or want to revise everything. That's a comment. Perhaps what Carla was saying about the committees, if you had an interdisciplinary team with expertise in investigation, had to work on this. I think that's an intermediate solution, because we have had situations where we've tied the committee to legal areas which should focus on contractual matters, but the lack of experience and expertise in the topic may affect them. Maybe financial things or parts of the clauses in the contract itself may be beyond their level of expertise. And so it's not something of interest to them, and that's why maybe they don't pay attention to it. So an intermediate solution may be what Hans said, to keep in mind what is the main goal of an ethics committee. What are they concerned about? They're concerned about the safety of the participants or injury caused because they want to protect their subjects, and therefore you should give them guidelines and say, as an ethics committee, we want to make sure that in the contract such thing is included. That would be a guideline or analysis given to the ethics committee so that it doesn't contradict ethical criteria, because otherwise they'd have to be having to review the contract, because we have to keep in mind there is a relationship between informed consent and the contract. If we're an ethics committee and we want to make sure that the guarantees in the contract are effective, there has to be a reality that comes down through a contract. So as an ethics committee, you could give a guidance to the legal area and say, look, as ethics committee, we want to make sure that the contracts cover this. The rest is your area of expertise. That could be an intermediate solution. Before giving the floor to Ariel, we have to keep in mind then when you're talking about a system and there are different tasks to different parties, there has to be a system, and there has to be therefore coordination and collaboration. As Carlos just said, the fact that the task is done by another one does not mean that there's no dialogue between them or intervention. The same thing happens with the Ethics Committee and the National Regulatory Authority. The task that one body does the task doesn't mean there's no dialogue between them and coordination between them. Sorry, Adrian. Yeah, excellent comment. I'm going to change the focus a bit based on many of the questions that have been asked. The Carlos presentation focused on the traditional system for clinical trials of the pharmaceutical industry. So it talks a lot about the sponsor, about tripartite agreements or four-party treatments. So my question is, what happens in clinical trials with human intervention, but that do not have a sponsor in the pharmaceutical industry, or no sponsor whatsoever? Just the researcher is his own sponsor. How does that work with this kind of a contract? And how does the insurance policy work for this?
No,
Well,
Son
That's-
realmente preguntas muy
Uh,
puntuales que
It's funny
son
because it's very
puntuales.
specific questions,
Voy a empezar a
but
traer.
they are
Cuando vos decías qué
affect
pasa
the
cuando
entire
una
structure.
persona es,
So what you
digamos,
say when
el propio responsable del
somebody
diseño del estudio, el que lo va a
is
conducir,
the one
no
who
hay
is
un
responsible for the
patrocinio que
study,
sea más
he's the
allá
one
del
leading the study.
investigador,
There is no
no hay
other
un responsable
sponsor.
que no sea el propio
There's
investigador, y lo
no
que
other
nosotros
party that's
llamamos, al
responsible
menos a mí me ha
other
pasado,
than the
proceso
researcher.
de
What
investigación,
happens?
iniciativa del propio
We used to
investigador,
call
que
it
a veces
a
suele
project that is
tener algún
initiated
apoyo de otro
by
tipo, de una
the
institución
researcher,
externa,
but
pero el
sometimes they have some sort of
responsable es el
external
investigador.
support, and yet the
Ahí
responsible party
aparece
is the
esta obligación
researcher.
que mencionas vos. Entonces, lo que sí es una tarea del comité en ese
Well,
caso, no
then it would
Marten,
be
porque
the
pareciera ser que es una
responsibility of
responsabilidad
the
más que nada
committee,
por los comités,
and
pero sí es definir el comité
it's
si
the
en esas
responsibility of the
condiciones,
committee
por
that
ejemplo, en
in
un
these
estudio de bajo
conditions,
riesgo, sería
in a
necesario o no
risk
un contrato,
study,
sobre
then you
todo por
need
el
to
tipo de
include in
obligaciones
the
que
contract,
genera
especially
ese
with regards
protocolo.
to the
Porque ya no va a
obligations
estar la parte
defined by
financiera,
the
como me
protocol,
decías.
because we're
Ya no va
not
a estar
looking
más
at
la
the
responsabilidad de un
financial,
tercero, que es como decías.
we're not
Pero
looking
puede
at
haber ciertas
the
obligaciones
funding by
en el
third
manejo de
parties, but there may
datos,
be
en el manejo de
obligations in terms of
muestras,
data
en lo que puede llegar a ser la
management, the use
logística,
of
que debería
samples,
tener algún
logistical
tipo de contrato.
considerations that
Hay veces, por
require
ejemplo, que es un
mention
estudio
in the
originado
contracts,
por el propio
a
investigador
study that was
y
originated by a
un
research, and
ente
you have
externo,
an external party,
académico, de
an
la industria
academic,
farmacéutica,
a
el que fuese,
pharmaceutical
quiere
corporate company
trabajar
that
algún tema de datos que genera
wants
ese
to
proyecto. En
address
definitiva, la responsabilidad
that
que va a
data that
tener
is focused
ese
on
ente
this. The
externo va a
responsibility
ser
by that
solamente recibir
external
datos, pero en
party
realidad quien
may be
impulsa el
to
proyecto,
receive data, but
quien
those
va a
responsible
desarrollar
for
el
launching
proyecto,
the
quien es
project,
responsable
those
del diseño,
developing the
es
project
el
has,
investigador.
and the
Entonces, en ese
designer
caso
has
se
the
orienta muchísimo el
responsibilities,
tema, porque el investigador
the
debería
researcher
poder llegar a tener
should
un
be able
contrato
to
que le
sign a
permita
contract
transferir
that will
datos a ese
enable
tercero
the
que no
transfer
participó en el
of
estudio
data
y que
to
tiene
third
interés en los
parties that
resultados.
didn't
Esto ha
participate
pasado
in the
con muchos
study but are
estudios
interested, they're
observacionales
interested
sobre
in the
drogas ya aprobadas,
data, looking at
donde no está la
already
figura del
approved
patrocinador que
drugs
está
where you
impulsando
don't
el
have the
estudio, sino que
figure
se enteró
of
un
the sponsor
patrocinador,
launching
un
the
laboratorio,
study. It was a
que un investigador
laboratory
dice un estudio
that
observacional con
a
recopilación de datos que le viene
researcher compiled
perfecto
data
para su desarrollo.
for
Y decide
its
querer acceder a los
development.
resultados. Y
And
eso va a
people
generar un
want
contrato.
access
Va a
to
generar un
data.
contrato porque hay
This
responsabilidades en manejo de la
requires
confidencialidad, se van a sacar datos de la
a contract that
institución, va a
includes
haber acceso a los estudios
confidentiality
del investigador, por más que
stipulations,
sea un estudio
despite the fact that it's
iniciativa
a
del
study
investigador.
or an
Por
initiative
eso
at the
son otras
initiative of the
modalidades
researcher. So
que,
we're
como
looking at
dijo
other
Hans, entre qué
modalities.
modalidad
As
de
Hans
contrato
pointed out, we have to
tenemos,
look at what are
podemos
the
tener este
contract
tipo de casos.
modalities
Podemos
where
tener
we
el
may
típico
have
caso de
these types of
contrato
cases arise.
impulsado por un
We could have
estudio
a typical
patrocinado, que es el que vimos
contract
hasta ahora.
that was
El
launched at the
contrato en el
initiative
cual
of
vas
a
a generar algún
sponsor.
tipo de
The
resultado a un
contract may
tercero,
generate
pero es un estudio
results for the
iniciativa del
benefit
propio
of third
investigador.
parties, but
O
it's a
podés ser
study
también un
that was launched
investigador
at
que
the
desarrolle un
at,
estudio
at
como
the
propio responsable, pero que quiera
the
hacerlo
it was
multicéntrico.
done by
Y que
the
entonces él, como
original
coordinador del estudio que
sponsor,
él
and
mismo
since the
diseñó,
coordinator of
va a
the study
convocar a
who
otros
designed that
investigadores.
will
¿Y eso
also
qué
call
genera?
in other
Responsabilidad del
researchers. What
manejo
does
de
that mean?
datos, si va a haber
There's
una renta anual de
responsibilities
equipo de investigación,
regarding
y todo esto motiva
management
otro tipo
of
de contrato.
data
Ya es más
and
complejo,
confidentiality of
porque
data.
eso
So this
implicaría
becomes
o que
much
el
more
investigador o que la
complex. Here,
institución
the
ya
researcher, the
trabajara en modelos
institution
de contrato para
have
este
to
tipo de
work
estudios.
and
Pero
will
esta
work on
posibilidad
these
puede
types of
suceder.
contracts. But
Estamos
these
muy
kind of
enfocados en el
situations
caso clínico
have
por todas
come
las
up.
responsabilidades que
So
genera,
looking at
pero
the
en otro tipo de estudios
responsibilities in
también
clinical
sucede.
trials, and it comes up in these
A
studies.
propósito de tu
Sí,
respuesta, Carlos.
Just
Perdón,
to
sí,
answer that,
o no,
yes,
yo decía en general hay
Hans,
varios
well, I was
escenarios
saying
ahí,
that
¿no?
there's
Porque
several
podría ser una
scenarios there
institución
because you could have an
sin fines de lucro
institution
con un
that is
ensayo clínico de
nonprofit
bajo
with
riesgo
low risk
o de
clinical
alto riesgo,
trials or
digamos,
high
¿no? En
risk
general, ¿no?
clinical trials overall.
De bajo riesgo porque a lo mejor
Low
es un
risk
ensayo
because
clínico que
perhaps it's a clinical
pueda
trial
incluso responder a las
that could
necesidades del país,
respond
pero
to a country's needs and priorities,
digamos, no hay
but
mayor riesgo para los
there's
participantes, a lo
not
mejor
a
se dan
major
productos,
risk for those involved, the parties
digamos,
involved. It
de
may
los
be
programas, etcétera, ¿no? En
as
general, en esos
resulting in
estudios que puedan
specific outputs
responder
for
a
programs. So,
problemas del país,
so in
debiera
those
establecerse
studies
algún
that
tipo de
respond to
incentivos, pero
challenges faced by countries, you
no se
could create
debiera,
certain
se
incentives,
debiera
but
tener cuidado
you have to be cautious
en no disminuir la
in
protección de los
not
participantes, ¿no?
reduce
En
the
cualquier tipo de estudio en
protections and
general, ¿no?
safeguards for the parties involved
Muchos de
in
los
any study.
incentivos
Many of the
y los
incentives
contratos siempre debieran
and
estar
contracts
presentes, creo
should
yo.
always be
Muchos de los incentivos más bien
present.
pasan por
Many of the incentives
rapidez en las aprobaciones,
have to do with
más que propiamente
expediting
requisitos,
approvals
menos requisitos más, ¿no?
with fewer requirements.
Bien, en relación a este último punto que
So,
hablábamos,
regarding that last point that
¿cuál
was
es el
raised,
ámbito de,
what
digamos, de aplicación de los seguros? ¿Para qué tipo
could you
de
describe
investigaciones debería
the
ser
current
o es mandatorio,
situation in
obligatorio
terms
contratar un
of
seguro
the
y con qué
insurance
alcance?
policies? What are the mandatory requirements for insurance? When are they considered mandatory?
Bien, lo que ocurre es que nosotros
Well,
tenemos
turns out that we have
una distinción entre lo
a
que son los ensayos
differentiation
clínicos,
between
que como
clinical
bien se
trials,
trabajó en la consultoría con
as
OPS,
we
son los
mentioned in
destinados al
our
registro
work
de
with PAHO,
especialidades
that
medicinales
are looking
ante
at
las características
specific
regulatorias, en
medical
donde las agencias
regulatory
regulatorias
priorities, where
fijan
regulatory
la
agencies
obligatoriedad del
determine
uso.
the
Podríamos decir, como bien lo decía
enforceable
Hans,
and
y yo cito muy explícitamente
obligations.
en ese
We
sentido,
have,
porque
for
lo dicen
example,
expresamente, no
and
porque el resto de las legislaciones no lo
and
digan,
again,
por
it
favor,
as
sino tanto en el
Hans,
caso
I
del Perú como
defer
de
there because
Brasil.
in the case of
Dije
Peru, as in the case of
expresamente,
Brazil, I said
independientemente de esto, el
expressly,
responsable es el
regardless
patrocinador. ¿Qué
of
quiero
this,
decir con esto?
the
Que
responsibility is
el
always with
requisito
the
de seguro
sponsor.
es puesto
The
como
insurance
como
requirement
se
has been
conoce en derecho, una
established, as we
situación
know
en
in law,
garantía de un
as
tercero,
a
que en
guarantee
definitiva lo
for
que hace es
third parties that
responder
basically
por quien debería
responds
responder
for
por los
those
demás.
who
Digamos
should
que es
be responding in
un
these
doble
cases.
respaldo
It's a dual
exigido por
level of
la autoridad
support
regulatoria.
that is
Y a
required by the
sumas, uno podría
regulatory
encontrarse con
authorities.
situaciones en
And
las
you might
cuales
find
el mismo
situations
patrocinador,
where the
no es el
sponsors,
caso,
and
pero
this isn't the case, but
pongámonos a
it's a
hipotetizar un poco,
hypothetical.
diga, bueno, no, yo me la
The
banco y yo pago
sponsor
con mi
might say,
patrimonio
I will
todos
pay
los gastos del estudio, inclusive
all of the
inversiones, nadie lo va a
study's
hacer, pero
costs.
supongamos que
Nobody's going to
podría
do that,
suceder. Que
but
puede
it could
pasar con una
arise.
entidad
And it
académica,
could
puede
happen
pasar
with an
con un montón de
academic
cosas. Tengo
institutions. It could
suficiente
happen with
solvencia
many
económica para
stakeholders.
responder por
In other
eso.
words, I have enough
No
resources that
sería
I
una
can provide
obstativa
that.
para esto,
That
¿verdad?
would not be
Porque en definitiva, reitero,
optional
es una
because I
exigencia de la
reiterate,
autoridad
this is
regulatoria,
a
porque
demand by
justamente
the
lo que busca
regulatory
es que
authority because what
frente a
it
una
seeks
situación
is that in the
económica
face of
complicada del
economic,
patrocinador,
complicated
exista
economic
siempre la responsabilidad del
issues
tercero
faced
citado en garantía.
by the
Entonces, no vamos a
sponsor,
menospreciar o
we're not
subestimar
going
el rol
to
de la compañía de
underestimate
seguros.
the
Ahora, pensemos otro
importance
caso,
of
Adriel, como
this
bien decías
insurance
vos. Imagínate un
component in the
estudio de
equation.
investigación
But
realizada
imagine
por una
a
institución
research
donde la institución hospitalaria es
project
la patrocinante.
where
¿Por
it's
qué?
a hospital
Porque
that
ese
is sponsoring it,
patrocinante no solamente es quien
and
responde financieramente,
it's
es el
not just
responsable
a
por
sponsor
el
who
diseño del
responds
estudio. Ponemos un
financially.
patrocinio
They're
financiero,
also responsible for
metodológico,
the
científico,
design,
etcétera,
methodological, scientific
y arriesga,
research,
arriesga a los
and they
participantes
risk
a una situación
with the
aleatoria
participants to a
que es
random
extraordinaria
situation
en el
that
promedio de vida
is
de una persona. Y bueno,
extraordinary
y
in
ahí el
terms
comité
of
de
the
ética podría
impact
decir la
on
verdad.
the life
Yo, cuando
expectancy.
veo,
So when
evalúo
I
el
look
protocolo
and
y
I
me doy
assess
cuenta
the
del riesgos en
protocol and I
testimonio de los
realize
participantes, creo
that
que no es
there's a risk
suficiente
of
la
exposure for the
garantía de la
participants,
institución,
it's
sino
not
que
just enough
también
to have the
debería estar la
institution
garantía de
provide
una
their
compañía de
guarantees,
seguros.
but there
Pero
also
está
needs to be
muy supeditado a
guarantee
eso. Yo
provided
conozco
by the
instituciones que
insurance
directamente no, por
policies
más que sean
and companies.
diseñadoras,
So
las propias
despite that the
instituciones de
institutions are
proyectos de
involved in the
investigación,
design of
no
research
contratan
projects, they do not
pólizas de seguro. Quiero decir,
they'll
no
not
son las
take out
investigaciones que
insurance
van a la
policies.
autoridad
It's not the
regulatoria. No, es otra
research
cosa. Porque
units. It's a
responde
different aspect.
patrimonialmente. Por
So
eso es
when we
importante
look
también
at
al momento
the
de
property
evaluar la idoneidad
considerations,
del
when we
patrocinador, y
look
esto
at
ya
the
está por el comité de
appropriateness
ética, ¿no?
of the
Es saber con quién estás
standards
contratando. Porque muchas
complied
entidades
by the
académicas no contratan
sponsors,
pólizas de seguro.
many
Pero
academic
realmente al
institutions
momento de tener que responder por un
do not
participante,
take
¿tiene la
out
solvencia
insurance
económica para
policies.
hacerlo?
But
No es un tema
if,
fácil de
and
resolver,
this is not
¿eh?
easy when we talk
Pero con
about
esto lo que
whether
quiero
these
decir, que
entities
en
have the
definitiva el comité de
resources
ética
to
podría llegar a decir,
to
bueno,
um,
para seguridad de los
pay all the
participantes
costs for the
en este
safety of
protocolo,
participants in this
yo pediría
protocol.
también
I would
un
also
seguro adicional. Y a
request
veces
additional
no
insurance coverage,
siempre
and
depende de un
sometimes
ensayo
it doesn't
clínico,
always
no
depend
no siempre
on
depende de
clinical
un
trials
estudio de alto riesgo. Hay
or
algunos
high
comités
risk
que dentro de la
studies. There's
práctica
some
habitual,
committees
cuando se
that
comparan quizás dos
when you
técnicas o dos
compare
tipos de
two types
intervenciones que
of
ya son estándar,
interventions that
y
are considered
la
standard
aleatorización
and
de
the
asignar un grupo de
randomness
pacientes a una
of
técnica o a la otra ya
assigning
no
a group of
depende
patients to
del
one
propio criterio médico, sino del
technical
azar.
response or
Y en
another.
estos casos
In
algunos
this
comités
case,
han
some
opinado que
committees
sería
have
conveniente la
considered that it
contratación de un
would be
seguro, porque es el
better
azar el
to
que va a
take
decidir.
out
Y eso
an
puede tener una
insurance
potencialidad de
policy.
riesgo.
This could have a risk potential as well.
Sí, yo entiendo que
Okay, I
Ya no en el caso del
understand.
Perú, donde digamos la
In the
póliza es
case of
obligatorio en
Peru,
cualquier caso, ¿no?
policies are mandatory
Entiendo
regardless
que
of
en
the case
general
or
las
situation.
buenas
I
prácticas
understand that best
clínicas, las
practices,
recomendaciones
clinical
éticas,
practices, and ethical
es
recommendations
un estándar de que
can,
todo
are
participante debe estar
standards
sujeto a
that all
compensación
participants
y
need to
de
enjoy
alguna
and
manera
receive
una
compensation.
indemnización
Compensation in the
y ante
face
algún
of
problema que pueda surgir
some
como
issue
consecuencia del
that may
producto, del ensayo
arise
clínico, ¿no?
as a
Entonces,
result of the products tested in
debieran
these clinical
establecerse
trials. So
ordenamientos
we need to establish
también,
policies and procedures
inclusive, creo yo, para
that,
estos
in
casos en
fact,
los
for these
cuales, pues,
cases where
el patrocinador, el
where the
impulsor
sponsor,
de un proyecto de investigación
those
puede ser un
responsible for
hospital, el
research
país, ¿no?
projects, that could be
Porque se
hospitals
requiere
or
hacer
governments,
investigación, ¿no? Se
are
requiere
doing
hacer
it because
investigación
they
porque usted va a
require
hacerla o
these
hacerla, ¿no?
research. It's a question of doing it or
Entonces,
not doing it. So
se debería dar un ordenamiento
I
tal
think
que
we need to establish
se asegure esto
policies and
promoviendo este
procedures
tipo
that will
de
ensure that,
investigaciones,
that will
digamos, que son
support
escasas y a lo mejor
these
de poco interés
research
para
projects
organizaciones
that may
de
not be
lucro,
of
¿no?
much interest for profit making organizations.
Bien, solo para aportar algo más antes de
Uh,
cambiar el tema. En
Before
la
I
ciudad de Buenos Aires,
switch
por ejemplo,
topics, here in Buenos
cualquier
Aires,
estudio que suponga
any
intervención en seres
study
humanos debe
that
tener una
includes
póliza de seguro,
involvement by human beings
independientemente del esquema de
require
patrocinio que tenga.
insurance
En distintas
policies,
excepciones,
regardless of the
que sea
sponsorship.
público o con patrocinio público. Entonces,
It
pareciera ser que el enfoque es buscar
So it
solvencia,
seems that
buscar
the
en
approach is
definitiva
to
que al
try
final del
to
camino
ensure
haya alguien que pueda
that somebody is
solventar,
there
pagar,
to
hacer
pay
frente
the
a cobrar el
costs,
daño que sufre
to
el
cover
participante de un
damages
estudio.
inflicted on any
Acá hay muchas
of
Me
the
preguntas.
permitís,
Sí.
Adrián,
parties
que en este
involved.
sentido es
Well, in
justamente
that
si la
regard,
institución es
it's
patrocinante, la primer
precisely
interesada en tener
that
un propio seguro va a ser
if
la institución,
it's going to be
porque
the
se
institution
libera de
that
una carga
really, if
patrimonial
it's
que
sponsoring
primariamente le
this, then
corresponde,
they should
pero
have an
que
insurance
si tiene
policy.
un
It's in their
seguro lo deja
interest.
indemne de
And I
responsabilidad.
said this
Entonces,
that will
la
make them
liberan interesadas
again,
esa institución. Es lo
the
mismo que
first
cuando
one
ocurre
involved
con
and
un
interested
laboratorio,
is going to be the
un estudio
institution in
patrocinado, un
getting and
ensayo
taking out
clínico.
an
El que está
insurance
interesado en tener
policy.
un seguro
To have
solvente que responda
a
es el
policy
patrocinante,
that
porque si
the
no, en base
participant,
a los consensos
the
éticos
sponsor
grandes
will
vigentes,
be
a lo
able to
mismo que
provide, have
ocurre
the
con el ensayo
resources to
clínico,
cover.
la responsabilidad es del
So
patrocinante.
again, the
Entonces,
responsibility is
obvio que
going
va a
to
ser
be
el
by
primero
the
interesado en tener una buena
sponsor.
póliza, ¿no? Lo que
So they
pasa es que a
need to
veces,
have
como dice Hans,
sound
hay
insurance
que estar
policies. But as
moviéndose
Hans
entre la
already mentioned,
exigencia y la
we
posibilidad y
sometimes
necesidad de
move
investigar.
between the
Y hay veces en las
demands, the
cuales ya
need
estamos
for
hablando
research, and
de
sometimes we're
estudios mucho
talking
más
about
altos riesgos,
studies
donde
that are high
también es
risk,
iniciativa del propio
independent
investigador, donde
studies,
solventar una
or
póliza de seguro
researcher
puede ser complicada.
initiatives.
Yo conozco casos de algunos
We could
comités que han
see
planteado si
complications
hasta
there.
sí es
I've seen
necesario
committees
contratar
that
una póliza de
mentioned
seguro
whether
para
it would
estudios
be
observacionales donde
advisable
solamente haya manejo de
for
datos.
having
¿Por qué? Porque el manejo de datos
insurance
implica un
policies,
riesgo.
not just for
Pero
data
esto
management,
evidentemente
but
pone en
this
duda o pone en jaque
obviously
un
places in
debate que
doubt
tendríamos que
and creates
plantearnos,
a
a nivel,
debate
inclusive a nivel
that
regional,
we need to
sobre la
engage in at
calificación
the
del riesgo
regional
de las
level
investigaciones.
regarding
Aquí
how
hablamos,
we
¿de qué
can
hablamos cuando una
assess
investigación
the risk
de bajo
assessment
riesgo o alto
implications. We talk
riesgo?
about low and
Estamos en
high
una era en la
risks.
cual el
We're in an
procesamiento de
era
datos
where
pasa a
data
ser la práctica
processing
habitual. Entonces
has
podemos
become the
considerar que
norm,
eso
and we
sea un
consider
estudio
that
con
this
datos
is a
una
study with data
potencialidad de
that
riesgo
has a
extraordinario en la
risk
vida de las personas que
potential that
amerite y
might be
exija la
extraordinary in the lives
contratación
of
de una
people that
póliza de
would
seguro.
require
Pero bueno,
taking
yo
out
conozco
an
posiciones a nivel
insurance
público,
policy.
pero como decía
I've
Hans,
seen
existe
some
también limitar
that
la
have
investigación
advocated
de
this,
investigadores
but
independientes que quizá no
we
puedan
look at
solventar una póliza,
independent
lo que
researchers
justificaría
that
por
don't
eso un estudio
have the
observacional con
resources to
datos.
provide that level of coverage.
Quizás es bueno
Well, maybe it would be
pensar en,
advisable to think
creo
about.
que vamos como haciendo
I
zoom in y luego zoom
think
out, zoom in y
we're
luego zoom
zooming
out.
in, then we're
Quizás
zooming
hacer el
out.
zoom out un
So maybe
poquito,
we need to
am,
zoom out a
en
little
dos
bit
sentidos.
and
Uno,
at two
con
levels. First
respecto a
of
la
all,
gran diversidad, como
regarding the
mencionaba Carlos, gran
wide
diversidad de riesgos que pueden
diversity
tener,
mentioned by
que
Carlos,
pueden tener
diversity
los
of
estudios.
the types
Y
of
que no
studies,
siempre,
and that
uno debe asegurar
we need to
minimizar todos los
ensure
riesgos y proteger
that
a los
we
posibles
protect and
participantes con riesgos,
safeguard
si esos
the
riesgos se
participants
convierten en daños reales.
to make sure
Pero
that
esos riesgos no
if
son
these
todos de
risks become
naturaleza
real
médica,
dangers
no son
and
todos de
inflict
naturaleza de
injuries,
salud.
but they're not all
Entonces,
health related. They're not all
por
related
ejemplo,
to medical care.
riesgos
We have
ocupacionales.
other risks,
El riesgo de perder
additional
un
risks.
empleo.
The risk of
O sea,
losing
no,
your
no
job.
necesariamente va a haber
Not
una
necessarily are we going to have a
acorde a todos
policy
los
that can
riesgos,
cover
ni
all
una
of these
póliza va a
risks.
ser la
We're not
solución
going to have a
mágica a todo
policy
lo
that's going
riesgos.
to be
Además,
the magic
pensando en otro aspecto del
solution
sistema,
to
otro
these
aspecto del
challenges.
zoom out
If
al que
we look
quería
at,
referirme,
and getting back to the zoom out I was referring
uno
to,
no, un
we,
investigador, una
a
investigación no se
researcher,
conduce
a
en el aire,
research
¿verdad?
project
Hay una serie
doesn't
de
just come out
otras
of thin air.
responsabilidades. Alguien
There are other
mencionaba ahí
responsibilities.
los
Somebody
seguros de
mentioned
mala práctica,
those
mala praxis médica.
insurance to cover
Tengamos
medical
presente también en nuestra región,
malpractice,
en algunos
and
lugares se
we have
requieren,
to
en
be,
algunos no.
we have to acknowledge in
Lo que
some
cubre
countries you
no es
require that,
exactamente lo
others
mismo.
not.
Entonces estamos
So
hablando
what
de una
covers is
serie
not
de
always the
piezas,
same. We're looking
de
at
piezas
several
móviles, y hay que tener
jigsaw
siempre
puzzle
presente que
pieces,
otra pieza
and
móvil ahí
some
es
mobile
incluso la
component
gobernanza. Si uno está
includes
preocupado
governance. So if
con
you're
una mentalidad
concerned,
estrictamente,
if
acá
you're
voy con
if you're
con
focused
una
mainly,
mentalidad estrictamente, digamos, ética,
or
cómo
you have an
asegurar la
ethics
protección de las
focus
personas. Uno dice, bueno, el
exclusively to
seguro es un
ensure
mecanismo, sí,
safeguarding and
perfecto.
protecting people,
Pero ¿qué pasa si uno
what
está en un
happens
lugar
if you're in a
donde las
place
pólizas, donde
where
el
where
rubro económico de
the
los seguros
economic
no tiene mayor gobernanza y las compañías
insurance
de seguro pueden
component
hacer, digamos,
doesn't really have
lo
that
que,
much importance?
lo que
Companies
deseen?
can do whatever
Entonces, esa
they feel
seguridad
like
que un
doing. So
seguro
that
redundantemente
assurance that
debiera brindar
a insurance should
realmente no se
provide
logra.
sometimes is not
Entonces hay que tener
feasible.
presente
So we need to be aware that
que no
not
necesariamente un
only
seguro es la panacea, que no hay
that an
seguros
insurance
para
policy
todas
is
las,
not a
todo
panacea.
la
It is not the
diversidad de
cure-all
riesgos con los
to
que
address all of the
enfrentamos
wide diversity
y,
of
y
risks
que
that we're
también,
faced with. And sometimes
am, digamos, hay que buscar, hay que
we need
también tener
to
presente que hay un rol
be
importante de la
aware that
responsabilidad
there's
de
also a
las
key
instituciones que
responsibility in
debemos
terms of
buscar por fortalecer
liabilities
más
assumed by
allá
institutions. We
de
need to
los seguros.
strengthen that level
Hay
of
instituciones
responsibility
muy
that goes
prestigiosas que hacen
beyond
investigación, por
insurance
ejemplo, pienso
policies.
NIH,
You have research
donde
institutions like
no se usan
NIH,
seguros,
where
no
they
se
don't
usan
even
pólizas de
use
seguro.
insurance
Pero
policies,
el respaldo, el
but the
compromiso legal de la
support, the
institución
legal
y su
commitment by the
capacidad
institution
de
and its
atender,
resources, its capacity to
de
respond
responder a un problema de salud que ha podido
to
surgir
the issues that
es muy grande,
might
quizás más
arise
grande que la de
is
cualquier otro seguro privado.
enormous,
Entonces,
probably
eh,
more
tenemos que,
encompassing than any
es muy
insurance
importante tener
company.
presente
That's why it's important to be aware of these
y dar de
complexities
ajustar
and try to make the
las,
necessary adjustments
las
in
demandas,
terms
por lo menos
of the
el
demands.
pedido de que
In
haya
other words,
X en todos los
the
casos,
requirements for having
a lo
X
que es razonable y
minimum
darse un
standards that are
espacio también
reasonable,
a que
and
uno
also
pueda
provide
pedir
some
más
space
si
for
así corresponde.
increasing these
Pero
needs and
esa
requirements if it so
flexibilidad, digamos, hay que
requires. That
identificar
flexibility, we need to identify that
los
ceiling, that
casos en que algo es
those cases
absolutamente indispensable.
where something is considered totally indispensable.
Especificar además qué supondría
And
esto
specify
y,
what exactly that
y
means,
abrir la puerta a
and then
discusiones más complejas en el caso
open
de
the
que en
door to
otros
more
estudios, en
complex
otras
discussions
situaciones, otro
in
tipo de
cases where in
condiciones
other studies,
pudiera ser
other
otro tipo de
situations,
garantías,
different
digamos, creo
types
que
of
esa es la
protections
palabra,
or
pudiera ser
guarantees. I think
necesaria
that's the
y
right
que la
word.
mejor manera,
Guarantees may
la
be
mejor manera
necessary.
de
And
brindarlas, porque
what would be the best way
tampoco es
to
nada más que un
provide that?
papelito resuelve. Hemos
Because
visto en algunas
we know that
situaciones
a
en que,
piece of
por
paper
ejemplo,
doesn't
se
solve
dice,
things.
hay
We've
un
had
seguro, bueno, un
situations where
seguro,
they say, oh, they have
resulta que la
insurance.
póliza es de
Well,
un
it turns
país
out that
extranjero,
the
suena
policy is
fantástico,
from a
ay, la
foreign
póliza de
country.
este
It sounds
lugar, ¿no?
fantastic. Oh, the
Europa,
policy comes
y a la
from
hora de la
this
hora
place in
ocurre un
Europe.
daño,
And then
bueno,
when
pues tiene
harm
que háblele
occurs,
usted en holandés
try to speak in Dutch to
a la
the
compañía que maneja la
company
póliza,
that
¿verdad?
is
Entonces,
handling the policy.
digamos,
So
no para traer una
it,
complejidad
and I'm not trying to
pero creo que
just make things more
hay que
complex, but
tener
I do
presente
think
esos
we have to keep in
matices.
mind those different
No, Carla, yo estoy
nuances.
totalmente de acuerdo. De
Carla, I
hecho,
agree with
incluso
you.
yo cuando
In fact,
mencioné
that's why
hoy
when I
la
mentioned earlier
CCH, el
today
documento de las
the
Américas,
CCH and
menciona el
the
seguro
document of the
como que
Americas,
es en la
it
medida en la cual el
mentions
país lo exija,
insurance
pero da
that
a entender que puede
only if the
existir otro
country
tipo
requires it, but it
de
sort of
responsabilidad que no
implies
necesariamente
that there
sea
may
una
be a
póliza de
different
seguro. Y
kind
yo
of,
creo que caímos, y lo
responsibility
veo yo
that may not
en la
necessarily be an
consejería
insurance
ética,
policy. And I
cayeron
see
con una
this in ethics
demasiada
committees
creencia en el
that they've
seguro, como bien decías vos, la
given
panacea
too
cuando
much
no lo
belief
es.
to
Pero muy
insurance as
interesante
a
lo que vos
panacea,
planteabas
which
recién
it
en relación al
isn't.
tipo de
But
riesgo
just
que
as
estamos
you
mirando, ¿no?
just said
Porque,
about
a
the
ver,
type of
el
risk we're
riesgo de
talking
que una
about,
persona
the
sufra
risk of
consecuencias
somebody
laborales, ¿es potencial, es
suffering
posible, no es
work job
posible? ¿Qué
consequences.
tipo
Is
de
that
cobertura
possible?
debería
Not
tener
possible?
frente a
What
esto?
kind of
Y al
coverage should be
mencionar el tema
provided
de
for this
salud,
or in the area of health. It's very often the regulations are biased towards biological and medical harm instead of other kind of harm. But if there are other types of harms possible, then we have to ask ourselves at least three things. One, what kind of harm are we talking about? What is the magnitude? What is the frequency with which that harm could occur on a daily life, which is different from a research project? And that's what will lead us to establishing a parameter as to whether there is a need for another fee or not, or as Paula said, and Carla said, we need to strengthen the institutional responsibility or liability, because very often insurance companies suffer losses, or and they have bankruptcy and they disappear. So I think when talking about the insurance policy for data management in Argentina, and I ask myself the same questions as you have, how far are we going to think that this paper is going to save everyone completely? No, it may not be true. It's a fee required by regulatory authorities, yes, and it is established in current good manufacturing practices. But is that the solution? Is that a guarantee? It's just one more level of protection. And that's why the fundamental question is, what is the role of the sponsor? What is the role? That's why we said there has to be an agreement of the CTA. In Argentina, we had the same situation as what you mentioned at NIH. When the state hires, they don't take on insurance policy. The liability goes to the government or to the province. And insurance requirement is a formal requirement, but it is not as valid as the liability of the government itself. Let's change the focus now. Let's go back to contracts. We talked a lot about insurance now. So in terms of harmonization and how we establish consensus, how do we standardize this for the region? I'd like to ask you, Carlos, what do you think are the minimum elements that should be included in a clinical trial contract? Well, I could sort of give you a very brief list, overview, because we're still working on this at PAHO, but we need to identify all the obligations in performing the study, and which be of interest to the sponsor, because it'll have to do with the quality of the report generated, and response to Resolution 75.8 of the World Health Association, where it specifies how the study should take place according to CTA standards. When you may say, well, why include this in a contract when in fact this is an agreement about research practices? Well, because if you have a contract, it would be liable if it does not comply legally. If I don't have contract, then there's no way to sue. And so you have to include how the contract is handled, how do you obtain the authorization of the regulatory authority, what kind of publication system will use, what will be your response if there is injury, or what Hans was talking about. In addition to insurance, is there going to be a fund or somebody responsible for reimbursing the procedures and the researchers? There have to be provisions on the handling of data and the confidentiality, and of course, the role of informed consent. And you also must obtain approval from the ethics committee. You need consent, protocols, and amendments, and also some system for indemnity. This not only responsibility for liability for injury, but also to hold the researcher and institution liable for any damages incurred. Somebody said, oh, well, but insurance, does it protect the sponsor or the person being insured? Well, that's not the case. But the sponsor says to the sponsor, you who are responsible for a harm, I will respond in your case because I'm the insurance company. But that actually also protects and includes harm caused by the sponsor during the study in terms of the institution and the researcher itself. So if there's a lawsuit against the institution or against the researcher for harm caused by the study, and the participant doesn't care who pays and who, they're just going to sue everybody. But because there is indemnity granted by the contract and the insurance policy, well, then the insurance policy will take over and defend the researcher and the sponsor. That's why in coverage certificates, there is an inclusion of coverage protecting the institution and the researcher, the investigator. So the main party covered is the sponsor, but it also protects the investigator and the institution. That's why it's so important to have it written in such a way. There are many considerations that can be taken into account. The obligations of good clinical practices, the indemnity system, the liability for costs and harm, the inclusion of insurance policy. Now, under that, there's hundreds of clauses, but those would be the general categories.
Bien, bueno, y respecto a eso también, avanzando
On that
hacia la
point,
posibilidad de estandarizar esto para la región.
talking about how we can standardize this for the region, what strategies do you think would be feasible to achieve basic consensus and also to be able to come up with some sort of model document template that could apply to the entire region? Can we develop a strategy to get us to that point? Well, if you allow, I'd like to say that I feel fairly optimistic that we will be able to achieve this. Why? Well, because the analysis we have done about the various standards has led us to see that basically the entire region is using the same language. There may be some different operational aspects that depend on the legal system of each country, but in general terms, in terms of good practices, responsibility for the cost or for harm and injury in all of the indemnity regimes, in that area, all countries are pretty much aligned. That means that we could have a general agreement where a contract could be used at a regional basis and that we could standardize it. Now, it's also true, as we said earlier, that a failure of a contract will mean that study will not take place. And that is a very complex issue. And so we need to see what can we do to make sure that this doesn't collapse. Because if the contract doesn't work, then the study won't take place. So I think a good strategy is to establish framework agreements for the region. What does this mean? It means that if I, as an institution, have a lot of studies sponsored by a specific laboratory, then I reach a framework agreement where I cover all of these clauses only once, and then for each specific clinical trial, it becomes an addendum or a charter covering that study. That would cover negotiation 100%. I have some experience in this in one of the centers where I work, and we reached a framework agreement. Now, it does mean a lot of discussion meetings with the sponsor, with the legal area, but once you reach that agreement and you've concluded it, then every clinical trial is a question of proving the budget and who will be the investigator. And you put an end to this discussion of contracts. So that takes a lot of time, and very often it is so much time required. And if you have to add to that the time for the committee to review the contract, et cetera, you end up with a big problem. So I think that trying to achieve these kind of operational strategies, having framework agreements in the region where we have one single contract and the rest would become just addendas, at least in my case, it's given me some very good results. I'd like to thank Carlos personally, because when we were at the meeting in Brasilia, and everybody was complaining about the different areas in the region, the different roles, and everybody was complaining about the same thing. He, with his optimistic view, said, why don't we propose a standardized version? And I think that the work he has done demonstrates that, yes, it's perfectly feasible, because it's not that we have substantive disagreements. It's just each one of us got to the goal from our own perspective, but it's not that we are in disagreement with others. So we at PAHO, if you go and look at that Brasilia document, you'll see that there's some recommendations included there. Those recommendations are already underway, some of them, and part of the recommendation is to propose developing a standardized contract and develop a standardized insurance policy, as Carlos has mentioned, and we've been working on that with him. And then with the support of Adriel, we have set up a group of experts in the region, a diverse group, for them to review the drafts. And as said in the Brasilia document, we have now already established a regional forum for the national bodies that accredit ethics committees. These are national bodies that have a role in ethics operations. We also have a forum of the regulators, specifically the section on clinical trials. As you know, PAHO, for years now, I think 30 years, has REPAR, the national regulatory authorities, but as a subnet of the PARF net, there's a network of all the regulators, and we to share the drafts with these bodies as well, this group, because they represent all the countries in the region, and they could provide us with good feedback. And the idea is to therefore come up with a standardized, agreed upon version that will make our work in the future easier. As somebody said, but how do we get from something theoretical to something concrete? That's what we're doing right now. I'm an optimist like Carlos is. So I think this is something that's perfectly feasible because it's a need we all have. It's not a problem that we're inventing. But I also think that if, as part of this series of virtual seminars, we had a session on the Smart IRB project of the United States. And if you'll recall, Barbara Beer, who was also present at the meeting in Brasilia, gave a presentation on the US policy, which is you have one single ethical review. One single review presumes that you have a contract. Let's say you have 5 institutions involved and the ethics committee of only one reviews it. Well, that means you have to have a contract between all those institutions to check which responsibilities will be retained by the institution and which one is transferred to the other institution whose ethics committee will review it. So the experience shared by Barbara with us at that meeting in Brazil is recorded and it's on our webpage. And it's a strategy similar to what Carlos has been explaining. It's what they call, the US calls a smart IRB. It's a standardized contract. Once everyone is in agreement with it, then adding something is very simple. So we have the concrete initiatives. We have already established the working groups. And this is not a unilateral proposal from PAHO. It's a regional effort where we are trying to involve all the parties. And I think we'll have a draft which will probably be the first webinar we have in January, maybe February, where we will present this draft to you and then listen to your feedback. See if we can come up with a, I don't know, smart CTA. I don't know what name we'll give it, but thank you for supporting this. Carlos, I think I saw a comment that says that the opinion of the sponsors is very important. And yes, of course, that's true. In my experience, when we've reached a framework agreement at the ministerial level, my experience is at the ministerial level, and when we've been able to reach standardized agreements at the ministerial level, it's because we involve the sponsors. And I completely agree. We want them to agree to the clauses we've proposed. These are standardized clauses that take the customary points included and are replicable in the region, except for some specific point that may have to do with any specific procedure addressed by the law, let's say the pacto commissorio or the resolutions clause, etc. The rest of it, if I have a country that's aligned with good clinical practices, then a contract template this type it should be accepted because it's just a reflection of what already is. If it says that it has respond for harm, well, then the contract states who does that. If you have to have informed consent, the contract will say you can't start the study unless there is informed consent approved by the regulatory authority of the ethics committee. That's why I'm so optimistic that we can harmonize this because we're all speaking the same language. It's just that sometimes bureaucracy, red tape, negotiations that delay the negotiation. And I think that's our goal to overcome at an international level. We all have the resources, we have the tools, but the implementation gets bogged down because of that. Now, if we're not able to do this, to streamline this, we're not going to be able to develop a regional framework.
Regarding this point, how could this function in practice? Well, we need to have a contract model with basic standard clauses. I think that would be a meaningful contribution if we reach an agreement between the regulatory authorities so that we can provide specific text, standard texts. So if we have, if we look at that, how could we manage, for example, the timeframes in terms of the managing of these agreements? And I think that's complicated because this has to do with something related to private international contract law, and then looking at the national authorities and their jurisdictions. I think what could be done is perhaps work when we look at standard clauses, whether those standard clauses would be useful for operationalizing things that are required by the local authorities. The national authority would not get involved in the case of these contracts. They wouldn't be able to. It's not in their jurisdiction. But you would have an agreement that just as you have best clinical trial practices, we think that the best way to reflect those research practices in a contract is that the contracts have specific characteristics and standard characteristics, because I see it a little difficult if we involve the private international law requirements and contracts, and all of the contracts that we read and analyze are that we signed. For example, we've signed with foreign parties, with foreign country locations. When we work with public sector entities, this could be somewhat complicated. Now, if we say that the proposal for this contract is such and such, and does this reflect what the regulatory authorities consider appropriate? And as Hans said, many people mentioned in the chat, the regulatory authorities just demand a policy, insurance policy, and a contract. All the details all the other details don't concern them as much. What I wanted to comment was,
entiendo que y conozco
and I understand
los más preocupados muchas veces en nuestros
that
países por el
those
contrato y
most
por la
concerned
necesidad de
over
tener esto
contracts in our
estandarizado
countries
y
and
que
the
se
need to
cumplan
have
estos
standard
estándares son las
clauses
instituciones donde
and
se realiza la
provisions
investigación
were
y los
those
patrocinadores, ¿no?
institutions that conduct research and
Digamos,
the
estamos viendo el
sponsors.
lado de la
So
protección,
we're
¿ok? Y
looking
eso
at
es
the side
importante,
of
pero
the
el contrato
safeguards and
también está en el lado
protections, but the
del
contract also looks
financiero
at
para implementar
the financial
rápidamente
aspects so that
el
we can implement
estudio en la
quickly,
institución.
carry out
Y
these
los mismos
studies for the benefit of
patrocinadores
the
y las
institutions, and the
instituciones,
sponsors and
las que trabajan en esto
institutions,
mucho
those
tiempo,
that
están
work in this field for a
suelen
long
estar
time
muy interesadas en
are very
estandarizar,
interested
en
in
hacerlo esto viable y
standardizing, making
transparente,
this
porque esto agiliza
transparent
mucho el
and
proceso, porque
viable,
resulta que en un
because this
país
would
cada
enhance the
institución puede
processes. And each
trabajar
country, each
diferentes tipos de
organization might be
modelos y
working with
entre los
different types
países
of
diferentes,
models,
esto puede
and they vary
volverse,
from country to country, and
digamos,
this could
como un
become
cuello de botella
a
burocrático,
bottleneck,
etcétera, ¿no?
a
También.
bureaucratic bottleneck.
Solamente, digamos, contando un poco sobre el
Just
trabajo que hace
to
el Programa
look at
Regional de
the
Bioética, nosotros
efforts
apoyamos
undertaken by
directamente
the
las autoridades
Bioethics Committee,
nacionales
we support
a
national authorities
revisar,
to review,
actualizar, a
to
fortalecer
update,
sus
and
normativas
strengthen their
y en
standards
ese
and,
sentido,
and procedures.
y bueno, hay un apoyo
And
paralelo a las
there's a
autoridades
parallel
regulatorias
line
nacionales, lo
of
hacemos de
effort
manera
with
muy
the national
coordinada.
regulatory
Ustedes han
authorities.
conocido
We
en sesiones
coordinate these
previas
efforts, and I'm
a
sure you've
Patricia
seen
Saidón,
previous
y de hecho
actions.
es porque
And
trabajamos de manera
this is
coordinada, que
why,
es,
well, first of all,
es
we work in
seminario,
a
es un esfuerzo
coordinated
compartido de
fashion.
ambas
And
unidades,
this
¿verdad?
seminar is actually the
Pero
result
se invirtúa
of the
ese
efforts of
apoyo
these two
directo
units.
que
But providing that
nosotros también
direct
tenemos una
support, that
posibilidad
where
como
we have
OPS
the
de
possibility as
incidir
with
y
PAHO
de
to
alentar a que los
encourage
países
countries to
adopten
adopt
estas pólizas, estos contratos
these
estandarizados,
policies and
porque
standard contracts,
efectivamente
because in effect,
hay un,
there is
quizás diría que en los últimos casi 15
that
años
I would say over the last
no he
15 years,
percibido como ahora,
I have
luego de la
not
pandemia,
seen as much as after the pandemic
un deseo tan
such
grande,
a
una iniciativa tan
pressing
sólida de los países de la
desire
región
and a
de
solid
adherirse a
initiative
estándares
by countries in
internacionales
the
para la
region
investigación, de
to
agilizar la
become a
investigación,
part
porque
of
como
the
les decía al
body
inicio,
of standards and
la
accelerating the
resolución de la
process.
OMS fue un pedido de
This
nuestra región, ¿no? Entonces
WHO
uno ofrece
initiative
algo,
has been widely
una
welcomed in the
herramienta, una
region. So now
posible
there's a
solución
tool, there's a
desde la
potential
OPS, pero
solution
también
from
esa
PAHO,
solución
and the
es una
solution
solución, un problema sentido ya
is the
para,
result of
por las autoridades
issues
nacionales y
that
para
are
el cual
considered
todas las
priorities
partes
for the national
relacionadas a la
authorities, and
investigación
all of the
están
parties involved in
buscando, queriendo
research
cuando menos una
activities
solución.
are
Así que
trying to find
hay
this
razones para
minimum
estar optimistas.
solution.
Bueno, volviendo a la lógica del zoom
All right,
out y zoom in,
getting
volvemos
back,
enfocar en
we
algo
went from
muy
zoom
particular,
out,
muy
now we're
puntual,
going
pero
into
que
zoom in
es
mode.
una síntesis de muchas
I
preguntas en
think
general.
this summarizes
Volviendo
many
a las
questions,
pólizas y a la
and
cobertura en
getting back
general
to
de
the
ANSES,
policies and the overall
¿cuál es el
coverage,
alcance
we ask,
que debe
what is
tener
the
esta
scope
cobertura? ¿Cuál es
that
el
this
alcance de
coverage needs to
resarcimiento?
include? What
Gama
is that
planteaba, por ejemplo, hablaba
scope? We
del
talked
daño,
about
de perder el empleo,
people
o en
losing
otros momentos hablaba
jobs.
de
We were talking about
salud, la
other
salud mental,
risks.
la salud
We talked
física.
about health
¿Cuál es el alcance en
risks,
términos
risks to
generales, digamos,
people's
sin general,
personal
¿no?
and
Asumiendo que es el
physical
régimen de
safety.
cada país en
So
particular?
again, when we
¿Cuál es el
look at the
alcance que debería
scope,
tener
what
una
is the
cobertura
scope
para los participantes
that
durante un ensayo?
coverage should include
En
for all of those
principio, se me
participating in
pregunta
these
las
trials?
lesiones
Well,
provenientes
they need to
de
be,
la atención
they
médica
need to provide
quirúrgica,
coverage from
los procedimientos
injuries
o la droga del estudio.
as
Sin
well
embargo,
as medical care
la cobertura
from
que establece
trials
la
using
póliza de
these
seguros
drugs.
no
Now, the coverage in the insurance
quita la
policies
posibilidad
does not deny the
al
possibility
perjudicado a que reclame otros
of
seguros que existen
victims
en la responsabilidad
to
civil.
claim
Quiero decir con
other
esto, no es una
damages
renuncia de derechos.
established in
¿Bien? ¿Por qué? Porque es muy común ver
public
que
law.
de
It's
repente
common to
si
see, for
hay
example,
pérdida de
that
la chance, si hay lucro
if you
cesante, si hay un
have
montón de cuestiones
people who have
anexas
now
como
become
rubros en la responsabilidad
unemployed
civil,
or
no va a ser
they're
lo
laid
primero que va a
off
cubrir la compañía de
because
seguros.
of
No es así. ¿Bien?
injuries,
Por eso es
the
que
insurance
claramente
policy may not
estamos
coverage
hablando
this.
hoy
So
de
what
la
we were talking about today,
corresponsabilidad.
that
Hay cuestiones
co-responsibility,
ciertas, objetivas,
there are
las cuales el
specific
seguro debe responder
objective
automáticamente. Encontrar
factors
daños
that
médicos,
insurance policy needs to coverage right away, coverage for injury, for in illness. The rest of the coverage features that are part of compensation are basically subject to legal review or a court review. So it does not leave free those of the other types of liability. Each country has specific limits in terms of liabilities between immediate and potential consequences after the trial. So this has a lot to do with the legal liabilities, and so we need to have that coverage that in case other types of damages suffered are brought forth before the courts, and if they don't pertain to the sponsors, then the informed consent does not mean that the participant are going to waive those other rights. So again, you don't waive the rights that are maybe beyond the damages encompassed in insurance policies. Now, if you tell me what happens in the final analysis if it turns out that other damages have to be paid, a judge might consider that the company involved is liable for other damages not envisioned in the insurance policies.
Bueno, entiendo que ya estamos llegando
All right,
final
I
de la actividad.
understand
Me
we're
disculpo
getting
por
to the
las
end of
preguntas
this
que pude haber
activity,
pasado por alto. Es un tema
and I'm sorry if I haven't covered
recién
all
estamos
the
empezando a
questions. I
acercarnos
know
y
this is
que
something that we're
va a
just
generar
beginning
algunos
to
encuentros más, así que
delve into,
por
and
mi
we're going to have
parte
more
les agradezco la atención y ya le
events. And
cedo
I want to
la palabra
thank you
nuevamente.
and for your kind
Muchísimas
attention. And I offer the
gracias. Creo
floor once
que
again to Carla. Thank you.
no podría estar más contenta para
Well,
una primera
I could not
discusión
be more
regional
pleased
sobre
than what I've
los
seen with
dos
this
temas
first
relacionados,
regional
pero
discussion,
sumamente
looking at
complejos,
two
en
areas
los
that
que
are very
estamos
complex.
abriendo
And it's something that we're just
una
now
línea nueva de
opening up
trabajo.
in this new effort,
Como decía
as
hace un momento,
was
buscamos
already pointed out
es
earlier.
un paso, tendremos una
This is
sesión.
our first step.
No la tenemos agendada aún, no sé si será en
Although we
enero o en
haven't
febrero,
scheduled
sabemos
our
que enero
next
es el mes
event, could be
favorito de
January.
nuestra
I
región.
know January is not one of our
Pero,
favorite months to work
pero
in,
vamos a
but
buscar de agendarla
we're going to
apropiadamente
try
para
to schedule
compartirles
our next
un
event so that
borrador
we can
de
share with you
póliza,
a
un borrador de
insurance
contrato
policy and
que se haya
contract
beneficiado ya
draft document
no
that would
solamente
be
por el
the
trabajo
result
hecho
of
en
not just the
UPS
efforts
con
already
nuestros
undertaken with
consultores
PAHO and our
que permiten
respective consultants
avanzar en tantos temas en
that have
simultáneo,
helped us
sino
move
también
forward
con
in
la
so many areas, but
retroalimentación de
also
algunos
we're
grupos
going to
específicos,
enjoy the
con el ánimo de
feedback of
compartirles lo más
specific
avanzado posible para
parties
que
so that we
nuestra
can move as fast
discusión
and as
sea
far as
lo
possible so that
más
the
eficaz y el
discussion
mayor
can be
impacto posible.
as
Eh,
more
entonces,
impactful and
eso
also effective,
es lo que
as
les
effective as
daremos de
possible.
regalo
So
de
that's
inicio
our
del
present, our
2025,
holiday gift
uno de
to
los
you
tantos,
as we
y
can start
ha
off
sido
2025.
sumamente útil tener
It's
este
been a
espacio
highly
de
useful
reflexión,
dialogue.
escuchar las
We've been
distintas
able to
aristas
use this
desde tantos
space to cover
países
so many
de
different
cómo se ve el problema,
concerns,
dónde están
new
los desafíos, a
how
fin
the
de
problem
nosotros
is
tenerlos en
viewed, the
cuenta
various
en
nuances,
todos los pasos posteriores
and all
de
of the
este proyecto.
subsequent
Y como
steps
he dicho
that this
varias veces,
project will
con miras a
need
que
to follow,
cuando hay una emergencia en el
so
futuro,
that when
a
we
ver que podamos
face
tener el
future
gran
emergencies,
recovery trial de Latinoamérica,
hopefully we'll
iniciado
be
por
able to
nosotros,
conduct that
liderado por
overarching
nosotros,
recovery
que
trial
tengamos la
headed by
capacidad
us,
de hacerlo
so that we'll
rápido
have
y
the
bien,
capacity to do it
y
quickly,
para
to
eso
do it
tenemos que cuidar
well.
todas las piezas, no
And of
solamente la
course,
revisión
we
ética, no
need
solamente
to
los
take
protocolos de investigación, sino
careful
también esas
precautions with
piezas
each component,
prácticas que a veces son un
looking at
poquito
the
como el
practical
patito feo que
components,
descuidamos, pero que a
which
la
is the
larga,
ugly
como
duckling
nos
that we
recordaba
sometimes
Carlos, si no
neglect, but
alcanza,
in the long
pues
term,
no inicia un ensayo si no se resuelve.
we need to address
Entonces,
before
les
we
doy
start any trials.
nuevamente las gracias a
So
todos.
once again, I want to thank you
Disculpas
all
por
for
la
your
dificultad
participation,
con
and please excuse
el,
any
la suscripción por
challenges
parte de ustedes
that you might have faced
a la lista de OPS.
in
Yo he suscrito a todas
getting
las
onto
personas que han
the
compartido
list, enrolling
sus-
in
sus
the PAHO
enlaces.
list. I've
Y ahora
already
bueno,
included all of
les
those
deseamos
of you
unas
who sent
felices-
us your
unas felices
links.
fiestas, un buen
So now we wish
descanso
you a very
de
happy
fin de
holiday
año.
season.
Probablemente no empiece
Enjoy
ya, pero espero
your
que empiece
rest.
pronto.
We'll hopefully start up again soon. And now with the Bioethics Committee, as we embark on the year 2025, we will leave you with in the Bioethics website will include other resources that include our presentation on catalyzing ethical considerations in bioethics. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.
Gracias.
Thank you.